With that, I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. And Secretary Buttigieg, I'm hearing from constituents that they are concerned about a potential port strike across the entire East and Gulf Coast ports if a contract agreement is not reached by September 30th. This will be devastating for Arkansas businesses that rely on the ports to move their import and exports to customers. We're 90 days out, and I've learned that the negotiations have been called off. This is alarming, and it's up to the Biden administration to bring the parties back to the table to avert this economic catastrophe in September. What are your plans to make sure a port strike doesn't happen?
Thank you. Yes, this is something we are monitoring closely, and our message to the parties is that it is vital that they come together and arrive at a deal that does right by port workers and allows port operations to flow. We had a similar level of intense negotiations around the West Coast ports with ILWU. That came to a successful conclusion. Our hope is that the same will take place with ILA, and I'm in frequent discussion with the Acting Secretary of Labor and other administration members on what we can do to urge the parties.
You're optimistic there's not going to be a shutdown, because people have to plan way in advance for alternate routes and things. So,
we can't speak for the parties, but of course we are urging them to get to a deal before that September 30th date.
Good. So earlier this year, the Federal Highway Administration issued a proposed rule that would waive federal regulations governing the procurement and administration of engineering and design services by local governments. Now, I've heard serious concerns from engineering companies about the potential impact of this change, which could undermine the long-standing and successful qualifications-based selection process that has been the federal standard for decades. I appreciate the department's interest in easing administrative burdens on local governments that receive federal grants, but as a professional engineer, and I think maybe the only one in Congress, I'm concerned about the potential drawbacks of this particular proposal. Studies have shown that hiring most qualified engineering companies saves time and money and results in better projects and more satisfied owners. The QBS method also gives small and minority-owned firms an even playing field to compete based on their specific proficiencies. It's my understanding that more than 740 public comments were filed in nearly unanimous opposition to the FHWA proposal. Can you please ensure that the administration will carefully consider the views of the engineering community and the potential negative impact of the proposed rule on public safety and project cost?
Yes, I'll take care to look into that, and we want to make sure that anything we do that affects the relationships with the engineering community is responsible and conducive to good, effective, safe project delivery.
And I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about carbon emissions, carbon reductions. I know that's something that you care about. And can you tell us what percentage of the world's carbon emissions does the U.S. produce?
I think it's less than a fifth, depending how you count it, of which the single biggest economic sector is transportation.
Right. So the government data says 13.49, 13.5% is from the U.S. And like you said, the biggest sector is transportation. What's the percentage of that?
I don't have that off the top of my head.
29%. So if we take 29% of 13.5%, that gets us down to between 3 and 4% of global emissions come from U.S. transportation. What percentage of that is passenger cars and light-duty vehicles?
So I know it's one of the single largest categories. I don't have
about 57% of that. Mm-hmm. So if we take 57% of that second number, we're down around 2%. So if every internal combustion engine vehicle in the United States was magically converted to an EV overnight, what would that say the potential to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions would be?
By that logic, Congressman, none of us should ever vote. We are all doing our part to do something about a global change, and I believe America should lead the world.
I disagree with you on that. We should vote smartly. We should put smart policy in place. And last count, we tried to find the number, over 120 some odd billion taxpayer dollars have been put in subsidies for EVs. Now, that's if all the fuel going into these EVs came from non-carbon emitting sources. Do you know how much electricity in the United States comes from non-carbon emitting sources?
Even if all of that electricity came from fossil sources, it would still be cleaner because EV engines are more efficient.
I think you need to go back and look at physics a little bit.
Okay, the
because-
physics, Congressman, are that an EV engine is 90% efficient, where even the best ICE engines are lucky to get to
But
40%.
the plant that made the energy is not 90% efficient, and internal combustion engines are 25 to 30% efficient, but you've got the efficiency of the generating plant plus the losses in transmission, and don't try to make the efficiency argument. The bottom line is,
Well, I'm definitely going to try to make the efficiency argument because I think it's important.
well, use good data if you're going to do that.
Sure, well, the good data is that between the regenerative braking and the 77%
You're talking about once the energy's in
you get to about 90%.
once the energy's in the EV. The bottom line is only 40% of energy in the United States comes from non-carbon emitting sources. So that 2%, if you could make every vehicle in the United States an EV overnight, you would be less than 0.9% of world's global greenhouse gas emissions. We're creating great turmoil and change in our country with taxpayer dollars that are being spent inefficiently. I'm all for EVs, but let the technology catch up and don't try to ban internal combustion engines at the rate that you're doing. I'm out of time, and yield back and recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Boy, would I love to spend the next hour on that debate and get that information out there. I will point out that the petroleum industry has been subsidized for the better part of 120 years and continues to this day to have very, very significant subsidies. However, Mr. Buttigieg, Secretary, thank you so very much. I'm thinking back on the very first days of the Biden administration. Within a few months, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act became law. After 4 years where the previous president said, we're going to do an infrastructure bill, never happened in the previous administration, but during your tenure it did. And thank you so very much for your very significant leadership in making it happen, and also picking up a very, very important part of an American policy, and that is make it in America, buy American. And I know that you've worked hard on that throughout. It was one of the major parts, pieces of the legislation, and it's going into place. However, all of that seemed to have been held in abeyance by a waiver to a 1983 law that waived the Buy America requirements for transportation. So the good news is you're well into solving that problem. A couple of months ago, actually about a year ago, several of us brought to your attention this waiver, general waiver of the Buy America requirements of the 1983 law. My understanding is that you have a proposed rule out to terminate that waiver. And I understand that the finalization may be in progress. Could you please bring us up to date on that?
Thank you. Yes, Congressman. We're very focused on making sure that we square the need for swift and efficient project delivery with our administration's commitment to make sure that when we use American taxpayer dollars, it's buying things that are using materials made in America. We recognize that that's a long game because we're building for gaps in our manufacturing base that won't be filled overnight. But we know that we have an opportunity here to build those industries through both the demand and the rules that we have. Right now, DOT and the operating administrations are working to provide guidance over the guidance that came out from OMB to help specify any answers to questions that project sponsors might have, knowing that there's a lot of complexity to this. To be clear, some waivers may be required, but they will be limited, targeted, and conditional. And only offered when we're confident that it's the right thing to do and still does right by our overall goals to build American capacity.
Thank you for that. Those of us that have been on the Buy America train road for the better part of our careers are going to watch very closely about the breadth of those waivers and the length of them. Short-term waivers, perhaps necessary, but if they become long-term waivers, then we've accomplished nothing on the Buy America, Make It in America, and rebuilding our industry. I want to thank you and the President for putting in place an industrial policy for the United States. This is one piece of it. There are a couple of other elements out there I want to bring to your attention with regard to Buy America. Chairman DeFazio, when he was here, and Senator Cornyn and I and others brought to the attention of all of us that the China Railroad Construction Corporation and BYD were finding a way of bringing into the United States Chinese rolling stock from Chinese government-controlled companies. That seems to have been abated. I urge you to watch carefully. They're trying to get around that in many different ways. Finally, the application of all of this to airports. The waiver may apply to the airports. Watch carefully. The policy of the President was to make it in America, Buy America. You and I and others will work diligently to see that that happens. Thank you.
Thank you. You have my commitment to work with you on that.
Thank you. Yield back.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Babin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank
for
you very
questions.
much. Thank you for coming to the Hill today, Mr. Secretary. In 2023, the state of Texas received less than 2% of all DOT federal grant awards, despite having contributed over 10% of the funding to the Highway Trust Fund. Is Department of Transportation making any attempts to be more equitable in their distribution of federal grants across the states?
Thank you, Congressman. We pay close attention to the importance of geographic distribution as one of the considerations in our competitive programs. Of course, each program has its own criteria. Project proposals are evaluated based on how they score against their criteria. Certainly a number of some of the most compelling projects we've been able to support have been in Texas. We recently were able to award $25 million to the Port of Houston Authority, for example, out of our reduction of truck emission at port facilities program. This is over and above the formula dollars. But one other commitment we have is if a project comes in, they don't quite make the cut because it's an extremely competitive round, we will work with that project sponsor to help them put their best foot forward coming around next time.
Thank you. Why did DOT release notices of funding opportunities, or NOFOs, for federal grants such as MEGA, Rural, and Infra for fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 26, while we're still in fiscal year 24? And should not these grants be awarded in their respective fiscal years rather than potentially circumventing a new administration?
The short answer is in order to cut red tape. While there are some programs that are administered on such a routine basis that it makes sense to have an annual process and run it again every year, we think in other cases by folding in either multiple programs, multiple fiscal years, or both, in the same way that a common application for college means you don't have to fill your zip code in 7 different times, we can reduce the amount of bureaucracy for project sponsors and the amount of processing work for our own team as we're working through that.
What steps is USDOT taking to address the issue of grant agreements between USDOT and federal discretionary grant awardees that are taking more than a year to complete? And how can we expedite these agreements to ensure a timely disbursement of funding to the award recipients?
This is a topic that I'm very focused on right now, both in recent years and in the prior administration. It was not always considered unusual for it to take more than a year to get from an award announcement to a grant agreement. We think compressing that amount of time is part of what it'll take to deliver projects more quickly. Part of the challenge, of course, is that a grant agreement can only certify that a project meets federal requirements if it's actually true. But I want to make sure we take some responsibility for a project sponsor working through that process rather than just folding our arms and saying, you know, we're not going to sign off until you do everything on your own. So I can assure you we talk about this just about every week and are taking a number of steps that we think will help compress that process.
International freight movement continues to increase at incredible rates, and in Texas, our state agencies, including the Texas Department of Transportation and our Department of Public Safety, are working with autonomous vehicle industry to make border crossings seamless, effective, and efficient while ensuring illegals are not coming across the border. What national support and funding enhancements specifically to the border region will be proposed to accommodate the increase in freight coming from Mexico into the United States and passing through to Canada?
As you note, there is a strong and swiftly growing demand and flow of goods across that border, and it's going to be more important than ever to make sure it is safe and secure and at the same time that it flows efficiently. Several of our grant awards have gone to modernizing land ports of entry in ways that we think will help them efficiently do so. And our Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is very focused on making sure that inspection capacities keep with the times. Would certainly welcome an opportunity to work with Congress on any authorities or resources that might help us take advantage of those new technologies.
All right, and one last final question. Perhaps you read the editorial in last weekend's Wall Street Journal entitled "Biden's LNG Export Pause Hits Ukraine," and I have a copy of it here, which I'd like to enter into the record, Madam Chairman, that decried the Biden administration's decision to block LNG exports to our allies. This article specifying Ukraine, and this which seemingly plays right into the hands of Vladimir Putin. Secretary Buttigieg, you have responsibility in your department for the Deepwater Port Act, which would improve our nation's ability to export energy products around the world. However, I understand that your department is not implementing the statutory deadlines and notices imposed by last year's NDAA, and is not having regular or any in-person meetings with applicants so they can possibly understand the agency's concern. I've heard so much runaround, and I'd just like to know what the truth is, if you can.
I can assure you our Maritime Administration team works diligently on applications that come through. They are not subject to the restrictions that were cited in that article that are more on the Department of Energy side. We'd be happy to provide you an update on the status of some of the pending applications.
Great. Thank you, and I yield back out of time.
The gentleman yields. Ms. Titus is recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, it's nice to see you again. Thank you for your patience and waiting for us to come back to vote. It was great to have you in District 1 as we announced the speed train to California. That's going to create a lot of good union jobs, and it's going to be funded right out of that bipartisan infrastructure law. So thank you for working with us on that. You know, you've heard from many of my colleagues, and I agree with them, that Boeing's safety track record is a problem. In fact, I saw a cartoon in the paper the other day that said that airlines were given extra mileage points if you'd sit in the exit row and hold the door on during the flight. That is not the image that we want to project, because we've always been the leader in safety. But another safety issue that I wish you would address is the number of air traffic controllers. I've heard you say that it's a problem. We have a real shortage. There's a hiring target of 2,000 in the fiscal year 2025. I worked with Mr. Yackham on an amendment to the FAA bill to do maximum hiring through the FAA Academy. Could you talk about those deadlines and if there's anything we need to do to help the Academy with resources or changes that will help us to try to catch up to this shortage?
Thank you for your attention to this issue. We share that concern. Over many, many years, the number of air traffic controllers qualified and working has gone down. The good news is that's finally stabilized and begun to go up a little bit, but the problem is we need it to go up much more quickly. In order to do that, we've requested, as you mentioned, funding for to hire 2,000 in the coming fiscal year. We would welcome your support for that funding. We've also worked to increase the what we call the force multiplier of CTI, collegiate training initiatives that can work alongside, never at the expense of, but alongside our excellent facility in Oklahoma City to help get more controllers qualified quickly. And certainly eager to continue working with you both to implement all the provisions of the FAA reauthorization and just to make sure that the funding and the recruiting stays on pace.
I was going to ask you about the recruiting. How have you beefed that up? Where do you recruit? With whom do you recruit?
So we get a remarkable number of applicants every time we open a cycle, and we're encouraging people from all walks of life to consider a career that can be rewarding and lucrative. It's very rigorous, though, and not everybody who comes through the door even makes it through the first few steps. Of course, that rigor is a good thing, and I should assure you, none of the measures we're taking involve reducing that high bar of qualification, but we do want to make sure we support those applicants and help them meet those high bars so that they can have a great career and we can have the numbers we need in our air traffic control workforce.
Well, thank you for that. If I can shift gears a little bit to the drone industry, domestic drone industry, and the rulemaking that it's occurred in the past for the line of sight issue. You had 90 experts who submitted a report saying we need to do this, and they made some recommendations to the FAA. A rule was put forward. I worked with Mr. Graves, who chaired the aviation subcommittee, hoping to get something by September. Can you tell us kind of how that process is going? Will you meet the deadline? Are there any problems we need to address?
We certainly understand the importance of that rulemaking. There's complexity in this, the novelty of this issue. We also see the growth of these drones, and we know there's going to be more and more of them entering the national airspace. So I know the team is hard at work at that. I'll try to get you more of an update. We are conscious of the reauthorization provision, creating a time frame for that work to get completed.
I just don't want to see us fall further and further behind other places, Europe, Australia.
Understood.
Well, thank you. If you'll let me know, I appreciate it.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you.
The gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Graves is recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. It's nice to see you again. I want to raise three things with you. Number one, an issue you and I have talked about both at hearings and otherwise, just concerns about the impact of the IIJA when considering things like inflation, supply chain, and construction costs. As a matter of fact, analysis by Federal Highway Administration shows that from when the Biden administration came in till now, we've seen about a 69% increase in cost of construction. And at home, that is on the lower end of what we've seen. We've seen projects come in substantially higher. I think when you add in the regulatory agenda of the administration, you're seeing delays, and as you know, the burn rate of the IIJA dollars is not really appropriate. It's not as fast as I know you'd like to see it. It's not as fast as I'd like to see it. And I think the regulatory agenda, by heaping all of these new regulations, particularly in the environmental space, is slowing things down. So I want to read a quote from our former Democrat governor who just left office in January. He said, "We're slated to receive at $6 billion from that act," meaning the IIJA, over 5 years for traditional infrastructure-related service transportation, and that's going to be very helpful. But we also have to manage expectations. Of that $6 billion, $5 billion we were going to get anyway. So the additional funding is about $200 million a year. Again, that's very helpful, but there are a lot of people who think that the $6 billion is on top of the base funding. It's not. And in exchange for the $200 million we're going to get each year, our match obligation's going to be going up by about $50 million. And so again, the governor of Louisiana, former governor of Louisiana, is saying $200 million a year. You have an inflation rate, again, adding 69% in there. You do the math, that means that Louisiana is actually getting behind, not getting ahead in terms of the legislation, which I know is not an objective that you or I would like to see. Secondly, I've raised with you a number of times the criteria that we have concerns with where you came in and unilaterally, without statutory action, said that in all of your grants, you're going to consider climate change, racial equity, environmental justice, and enhancing union opportunities, criteria that I have concerns with because of the lack of metrics or specificity. And so translating that into impacts on the state that I represent, Louisiana, according to analysis by Politico, we are one of the fifth worst states per capita, in terms of receiving funding under the legislation. Concerning because a bridge program that former Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney and I wrote is in there that we thought was actually going to help our state. Concerning because some of the PROTECT Act programs that we also were involved in drafting is in there. Louisiana got zero out of that one, which is designed for adaptation and resiliency. So very, very concerned about what I tell people in Louisiana when folks look at IIJA and expecting it to be positive, whenever the inflation rate results in it actually not being helpful. The regulations are making it difficult to actually execute, which I know aren't all your issue, other agencies giving you environmental obligations. And then at the end of the day, when our home state is one of the fifth worst performers in the country in terms of a per capita receipt. It's very, very concerning. And then the last thing, if in the 90 seconds I'm giving you, if you could just give us a little bit of advice on your thoughts on how we address this growing deficiency in the Highway Trust Fund with the user fee being a static 1993 figure.
I'll do my best to cover that in a short amount of time. I'll start with a point of agreement, which is I think the environment we have with cost escalation just increases the pressure to get projects delivered quickly, get grant agreements signed quickly, and really improve on the pace that, I should note, is the pace that we inherited, where it's just considered typical to take a year or two. Now, sometimes the project isn't ready to go, but we want to help them get ready to go. I do think that suggesting that the cost escalation can be attributed to the administration's measures flies in the face of the data showing commensurate cost escalations in every developed economy in this sector, although maybe we could unpack that to see at a more granular level how it's affecting a particular region. Certainly want to work with project sponsors in Louisiana to build on the successes that have happened with Lake Charles, I-10, Lake Calcasieu, the natural gas distribution infrastructure, $10 million that came to your district, and the areas where they have been ferries and other areas where Louisiana has been successful. We want every state to succeed as much as possible in getting those projects done that might not have happened otherwise. I won't claim to have a magic solution on the Highway Trust Fund, but I join you in being concerned about it. I think by the time of the 2026 vote on a future, or potential vote on a future reauthorization, that question will really come to a head, and Congress will need to decide whether the user pays principle is the future or whether to continue turning to other sources of funding to fund our roads.
Before I yield back, I just want to commend you. I saw your 3-mile time on the race that you did recently. It looks like your running is getting a good bit better, and just want to congratulate you.
Appreciate you. I was huffing and puffing there, but we made it.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Carvajal is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Buttigieg, I understand that the U.S. Department of Transportation has announced that $520 million is available for Cycle 1 Charging and Fueling Infrastructure, CFI. This is for applications that are highly recommended or recommended. In my district on the central coast of California, the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments is spearheading a $20 million grant application that would fund the installation of 21 direct current DC fast charging stations along the US 101. SBCAG's application has been listed as recommended. When should applicants start hearing from your department regarding the outcome of their applications?
Thank you for the question. We're hard at work on the CFI program, which is a companion to the NEVI program. Already 47 awards have been made, amounting to $623 million, and of course future rounds will bring future awards. We'll be happy to get more information to your office about a timeline. I know that we had our latest notice of funding opportunity out on May 30th. Part of what we're trying to do with those rolling applications is to get quicker answers to our project sponsors, because we know how important these facilities, especially those DCFC, DC fast charging facilities that are challenging sometimes for the private sector to do on their own. We know how important those are to communities like those that you serve.
Thank you. I want to pivot to another issue of importance to my district that was brought to my attention by the County of San Luis Obispo. For decades, the federal government has required commercial service airports to use Florentine firefighting foams that contain PFAS. The recently passed FAA reauthorization bill includes a provision that I helped write for a new grant program that gives airports $350 million over the next 5 years to assist in their transition from aqueous film-forming foam, AFFF, to fluorine-free foam, F3, or foams that don't contain PFAS. What is the FAA doing now to help airports in their transition to these new foams?
Well, thank you for your attention to this issue. We know this is not just an environmental and safety concern, but also an economic concern for airports. FAA has done a lot of technical work, found that performance standard in partnership with DoD that does not require the use of PFAS. And now that that new standard has been put forward, there is a transition plan, an aircraft firefighting foam transition plan, published roughly a year ago with stakeholders from the DoD to firefighters to environmental groups. We will continue to work closely with our airport partners, helping them identify best practices, helping them prepare for this transition, and to the extent resources are an issue for them, welcome further opportunities to work with you on making sure they have what they need.
Thank you. Last year, OMB finally, after 2 years of uncertainty, clarified the Buy America provisions established in the bipartisan infrastructure law that did not apply to construction materials such as aggregate and asphalt binder. This would have put significant restrictions on supply chains for aggregate and asphalt binder. Will the administration continue to pursue new Buy America provisions? And if so, does the administration plan to allow for waivers on manufactured products?
We are continuing to work to try to ensure that project delivery is kept swift and affordable while meeting our Buy America commitments. The new guidance, we hope, is helpful to our project sponsors, but we know that sometimes it needs interpretation, and we want to make sure that we provide further guidance as needed. The Federal Highway, FAA, FTA, and FRA rules for iron and steel and manufactured products have not changed, but we continue to be ready to work on whether it's waivers or policy guidance to help make sure our project sponsors understand what's required.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, one of the FAA's most successful and cost-effective government industry partnerships for taxpayers is the FAA Contract Tower Program. There are 264 airports in the program, including the SLO County Airport in my district. This critical air traffic program, safety program, supports general aviation operations, DoD flight training operations, and military readiness, commercial air service, and flight schools across the country. What assurances can you give us that contract towers will remain a high priority for DOT and FAA?
These are certainly an important part of our national aviation system. There's currently a total of 263 contract towers in the program. I would note as one indication of the importance we place on them that the President's fiscal 25 budget request seeks $256 million to fund that program. It includes measures to try to cover the cost growth that has taken place. Vendor contract prices have escalated about 22% from 2020 to December last year. We're continuing to work to help them keep up.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Mr. LaMalfa is recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary, thank you for appearing with us here today once again. Appreciate it.
Morning.
Let's see. So on electric vehicles and the chargers, in the infrastructure bill a while back, there was $7.5 billion put forth for that. $5 billion that was allocated to states individually to build their own networks with that seed money. So the report I have is that since then, we've seen an intense amount of money go out, but we've only accomplished approximately 7 charging stations spread amongst 4 states. So we have this term investment that doesn't seem to be hitting much of a goal, as people are still frustrated with the electric vehicle owners we have still seem to have a lot of challenges finding what they need in order to go more than 30 miles from home, for example. So, and then the nature of the EV stations themselves they're exempted from the Buy America provisions. So we're buying these components from China and other overseas. So that's disturbing, because we should be building it here when we are, and we would have the ability, which leads to a couple more questions. But Secretary, with my understanding, there's another $1.3 billion that was added to that initial 7.5. Why are we doubling down on more when the performance so far has been basically only 7 stations?
So to be clear, there are 186,000 public chargers across the United States. That's about double what it was when President Biden arrived. Most of those have been put in by the private sector, but we believe that public sector involvement is necessary to build out the rest of the network, hence the NEVI program that you referred to. That program is intended to install tens of thousands of chargers in the second half of this decade, and we've already had 38 of the states that we're providing funding to release their solicitations for the program. We're even going to see the first few hundred of those chargers installed this year. As you mentioned, there's even a tiny handful that are up and running today, but I want to emphasize our expectations have been that the peak year for installation would be 27 or 28, because this is a totally new program for the states. I do want to emphasize also that these This charging program is subject to Build America, Buy America provisions. There is flexibility in that to recognize the fact that we're standing up what's effectively a new industry in the United States. But we're committed to making sure that that new American industry is homegrown, is creating jobs right here on U.S. soil. And as the states work toward their procurement, we think we're going to really see that demand signal lead to a burgeoning of that industry here in the United States of America.
The difficulty of the Buy American is that we don't seem to be able to produce in this country. Well, the mined raw materials have to come from somewhere else, and then the manufacturing pretty much stays in those other areas. And so we're not doing well at Buy American on what comes from the mines as well as the finished products. So
Well, that's a big part of what we're changing through the president's initiatives. DOE now estimates with the new awards, for example, for producing a domestic battery supply chain, that we will have enough graphite to support 47% of the U.S. demand domestically. We're also working on partnerships with friendly countries so that when we do need to turn abroad for materials or refinement, we're not necessarily turning to places like China. And increasingly, recycling will be important.
Well, let me
because
drill
some
down
of
on
these
that.
materials live indefinitely.
Thank you. Let me drill down on that. Would you be part of a group of voices that would say we need to mine these products in this country instead of somewhere else?
Certainly would prefer that they be sourced domestically.
Okay, thank you. On the EVs themselves, now we're seeing that there seems to be a turning around of attitude on that. Like Ford Motor Company, they lost $4.5 billion on them. They're down. They're bringing down the price of their electric pickup quite a bit, which that's probably going to be a loser for them. I don't know. And they're letting their dealers off the hook from having to install hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of infrastructure to be EV dealerships. So you see a retraction of that, as well as 7 in 10 Americans said they don't not want to buy an EV because it takes the charging isn't there, the battery technology. And then current EV owners, half of them are considering switching back to gas vehicles. So shouldn't we be tailoring it to people that want them? It seems like 10 or 15% instead of forcing people up to a complete ban by 2035 like California's talking?
Well, one of the reasons that we have not forced anyone to purchase any particular vehicle is we want this to be led by consumers making choices. And consumers are choosing EVs more every single year than they did the previous year. And I think that reflects the fact that as the prices come down, more and more Americans decide it's the right answer for them.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and a ranking member, and thank you, Secretary Buttigieg, for being here today. From the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in 2021 to today, there's been an immense amount of investment and steady, sometimes slow progress towards our infrastructure goals for the country. As we look to fiscal year 2025, I'm hopeful that we can build on this progress and continue to make transportation safer, equitable, and cleaner. Chicagoland is home to the nation's largest rail network. All the Class 1 railroads, as you know, traverse through Chicago, and my district has countless rail-grade crossings, rail yards, and rail workers. As such, rail safety is a huge priority for my constituents, and with the recently released NTSB report on the East Palestine derailment, it's a reminder that we must continue to press this issue. Secretary Buttigieg, I know that rail safety has been a focus for DOT in recent years, but there's yet to be a comprehensive rail safety changes at the federal level. In addition to the recommendations for more inspections, infrastructure improvements, and better emergency plans, what's being done to ensure that rail workers aren't put in harm's way?
Thank you for the question. As you noted, this is a central focus for us. We've sought to do everything that we can do short of an act of Congress in order to enhance rail safety. Two recent measures I would point to that we think are particularly important is our rule on minimum crew size. Most Americans would probably be shocked to discover that until we acted, there was no rule saying that you had to have more than one person, even on a 2-mile-long train. And the Class 1 rail corporations seem to prefer it that way. We thought it was very important to do this. We also recently finalized a rule requiring emergency escape breathing apparatus to be available for train crews and other employees as they're transporting hazardous materials, and cleared up the information railroads need to provide to community first responders about hazardous materials. But we urgently need legislation from this chamber and the Senate in order to raise the bar and give us more capabilities. A lot of people in this chamber had a lot to say about rail safety a year and a half ago in the wake of East Palestine. I hope that they will end their silence on this topic now and join you and others in insisting that there be action because with the NTSB report now complete, there is really, in my view, no remaining excuse for inaction when we need that legislation.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to do 2 more questions, so brevity would be appreciated. How is the FRA encouraging participation in its confidential closed call reporting system, and what can we do to get more rail lines to participate?
In short, there's been a lot of phone calls, a lot of letters, and a lot of pressure to urge the Class 1 railroads to honor their commitment to join that system. So far, we have brought Norfolk Southern on board with a pilot covering approximately 1,000 of their employees at several sites. And BNSF in April agreed to join as well with an agreement covering about 650 of their employees represented by the Dispatchers Association. But we would like to see participation at 100% and would welcome opportunities to work with you to drive that up.
Thank you. Fiscal cliff that transit agencies are facing nationwide. Our local Metropolitan Agency for Planning, also known as CMAP, has developed a visionary plan for action. Transit, as you know, is a fundamental cog that keeps communities like mine moving. Cutting service would have disproportionate impacts on those who rely on it. Secretary, what is USDOT? How are you supporting metropolitan planning organizations to rethink public transit and commuter rail systems as the funding cliff approaches?
Transit is so important to so many Americans. It provided 7.1 billion trips in 2023, and we've got to make sure they can stay ahead of these looming fiscal challenges. In addition to engaging MPOs, as you mentioned, I also want to note that the President's 2025 budget proposes flexibilities that would allow transit agencies to use urbanized area formula funds and flex funds for operating expenses. We think that that flexibility may be helpful for certain agencies as they try to bridge that gap.
Thank you very much. Yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes Mr. Bost for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, with the higher demand of goods and services, many of the industries rely on freight trucks to deliver goods and service to the customers. The administration has focused a lot on rail transit and aviation within the budget requests, but continues to leave out some important things involving truck drivers, specifically truck parking. Now, while rail is vital in the rural areas of this nation rely on the delivery of those trucks, we have also seen an increase in the amount of women that are now driving, thank heaven. While the industry continues to grow, all of these trucks are struggling to find places to rest and then while trying to abide by the federal hours of service requirements. My legislation, the Truck Park Safety Improvement Act, addresses a shortfall on the truck parking to allow safe places for our drivers to take a break from the long road without fearing of accidents, assaults, or robberies. Now I'm asking about, and I asked about this topic last year and was told that the administration was working on the truck parking, and I was upset to see the budget request did not include anything regarding truck parking. What are you planning to do to address this issue? Because this issue came out, the first studies in 2002, how bad it is that we need truck parking.
Well, first of all, let me applaud your attention to the issue of truck parking and make clear that we are applying not just words, but dollars and cents to this issue. We've been able to fund projects in Wyoming, Tennessee, Florida, and other locations to support truck drivers. So I can assure you, even if it doesn't have its own line item, it is something that we consider important for a number of programs like infra, and also are urging our state partners to consider this as a use of their federal formula dollars and are encouraging them to remember that they have that flexibility. I spent some time just last week with truck drivers, including a number of women truck drivers who were pleased to see coming into that career. It remains as vital a career as ever, and we've got to make sure that we're supporting the drivers we count on in every way. We're taking a number of measures, including dealing with predatory leasing and towing, and encouraging veterans to get their costs paid for training. But certainly agree with you that parking is probably the number one issue we hear when we talk to drivers, and we're working on it.
If we can shift gears on my next question, the Attorney General is initiating a rulemaking, I think this was brought up by Representative Crawford earlier in the day, to change marijuana from a Schedule I to a Schedule III Controlled Substance Act. As a truck driver myself that grew up in the trucking business, my brother is still in the trucking business, I know it's difficult to hire and make sure that our drivers are safe. Matter of fact, it's real difficult part of hiring right now because of the drug testing. But part of the safety includes knowing the driver could pass that drug test. It's not something that we want to stop. So I want to ask you about since DOJ's actions will stop marijuana testing of DOD-regulated safety-sensitive employees. Now, let me tell you who all this includes, including school bus drivers, airline pilots, train engineers, subway and public bus operators, ferry operators, truck drivers, pipeline operators, FAA air traffic controllers. Will you commit to ensure that DOT will continue to test for marijuana as it currently is permitted to do, even if it moves to a Schedule III drug?
Yes, our commitment to that testing continues regardless of the schedule, and we believe our authorities are intact too, because they don't call for testing by reference to where marijuana sits in its classification, but rather it's specifically named. So whether we're talking about the regulated community, those drivers you were talking about, or whether we're talking about our own personnel, somebody with a security clearance or somebody in a tower, our understanding is at this time is that nothing about that reclassification would change our practices.
Here's the problem. Well, just so you know, 1980s is when DOT did the result and resulted in the program that the accidents were caused by people using marijuana and the problems that occurred. If we don't stay with that program, and the thing that's difficult about that is right now when we have a driver shortage, you can have a beer on Sunday and you're not impaired to drive on Monday. Now you can smoke a joint on Friday. You may not be impaired, but it's going to show up in that test, and it'll show up for 30 days. Something's got to be figured out as far as that's concerned if we're going to continue down this path, because it makes it very difficult as a truck owner and a business owner to find the employees that aren't spending their time smoking dope in their parents' basement and are more concerned about having a job. And we've got to figure this out, and I hope that you'll continue to work on that to make sure that not only it's safe, but that we can also have drivers and figure out how we're going to do this if we're going to continue down this path.
Agreed.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Pappas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, welcome back to the committee. I appreciate your thoughtfulness and how much time and how accessible you always are to this committee, so it's great to have you back. And it's always a good time to talk about how the bipartisan infrastructure law is working for our districts. I see that in New Hampshire. We're set to receive about $1.4 billion in state formula funds for highways and bridges over 5 years, which represents a significant increase over what we could count on in previous years. And already about $850 million has been announced for New Hampshire roads, bridges, roadway safety, and other major federally funded projects. So Secretary Buttigieg, as you know, federal law allows states like New Hampshire to use toll credits to cover local match requirements for federally funded projects. But since states could historically only use toll credits for projects within the state where credits were accrued, many states left extra toll credits on the table. That's why I have advocated for legislation, the Toll Credit Marketplace Act, provisions of which were included in the infrastructure law, which will develop a federal marketplace for toll credits, which will allow states to sell any excess credits to cover the match required for federally funded projects. I think it's a common sense change. We discussed this last year when you were before our committee. I'm wondering if you can update us on any progress with the toll credit exchange pilot program that is anticipated to roll out soon.
Thank you. And first, let me associate myself with your enthusiasm for what the infrastructure law has brought. And most recently, congratulations to your district on the Rockingham Planning Commission successfully receiving that Seacoast Greenway Hampton Marsh Trail funding. With regard to the toll credit marketplace program, we recognize the importance of the value of an innovative program like that that you worked to create, and I know that they're looking to use their toll credits in new ways. I can report to you that the Federal Highway Administration has made a lot of progress on that. As you know, anytime you stand up a novel program, it leads to a lot of work that goes on in the background, which we're working through. But the focus right now has been developing the right program procedures, including the application and the selection process, making that as transparent and as rigorous as possible. And we'll continue to keep you updated on the team working expeditiously to get it stood up and ready to use.
Well, I appreciate that. I know my state has itself hundreds of millions of dollars of unused toll credits that are on the table, and I know other states are eager to be able to deploy these resources to make the necessary investments that will improve roadway safety and improve our economy. Now, my state's at a decided disadvantage when it comes to formula funding distribution. And since coming to Congress, I've worked to evaluate current funding structures to ensure states like mine get the adequate support that they need and that it's distributed in an equitable fashion. The calculations used to come up with the formula are, I believe, grossly outdated. For example, a state like Rhode Island, with half the roadway mileage of my state, received 30% more funding in fiscal year 2024. Vermont, which has about half the population of my state and fewer federal miles, received nearly 23% more in federal highway funds than New Hampshire did in fiscal year 2024. There are other states that are treated, I believe, inequitably by the formula, including Texas. I'm wondering if you'll conduct a study or providing any information for our committee as we think about the future of highway funding in terms of the formula and areas where we can look to make it more balanced and equitable for states like mine.
Thank you. We'd certainly stand ready to provide any information, data, analysis, or technical assistance requested as Congress contemplates future changes to the formula. As you know, we work to implement the formula as provided by Congress, but certainly hear loud and clear from many states who have found that the formula is not consistent with their expectations based on their needs, and happy to do anything we can to make sure that Congress's deliberations about that are well informed.
I appreciate that. Drunk and impaired driving traffic deaths have increased by 33% in the last 5 years. Even as vehicles are getting safer, crashes, injuries, and fatalities are still on the rise. In the United States, someone is killed or injured in a drunk driving crash every 39 minutes, and an average drunk driver has driven drunk nearly 80 times before their first arrest. Currently, only 24 states in the District of Columbia, including my state, require ignition interlock devices to be installed in the vehicles of first-time offenders. Studies have shown that the use of these interlocks reduce recidivism by up to 70% in first-time, repeat, and high-risk offenders. That's why I've introduced legislation on this, and I'm wondering if you can comment on ignition interlock systems and the role that they can play in terms of roadway safety.
We certainly recognize the promise and the potential of these interlock systems, given, as you noted, the proportion of highway fatalities and road injuries and fatalities that are associated with impairment. NHTSA has been working to help research, develop, and test solutions, including ignition interlock programs and the driver alcohol detection system for safety. A lot goes into that, and of course, need to make sure that anything that goes out into the field is ready to meet the high bar we're going to set for it. I would note that there was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking put out in December to gather more information on technology and research in this regard, and we'll be working through that ANPRM and continue to keep you apprised of progress there.
Thanks. We look forward to more information. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Johnson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, of course, there are always going to be a certain number of things you and I disagree on, but I have to start with a compliment. In a town where so many of folks, both in my party and your own, seem to peddle fear and anger, some of them almost exclusively. You bring a far more professional and respectful approach to your work, and the communication that I get from you and your team, I think helps all of us be better. So thank you with that. As you know, sir, we have a tremendous amount of flooding in my state and surrounding states. It's just devastating to watch people, friends of mine, who their home, everything, all the physical possessions that they own washed away by these floodwaters. As you know, during disasters, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has the ability to waive some rules, things like weight limits, hours of service, so that impacted communities can get help more quickly. I've got some concerns that a recently finalized rule by FMCA is going to make it more difficult for governors to access those flexibilities. I just wanted to gauge any thoughts you would have on that promulgation.
Let me certainly, first of all, tell you that our heart goes out to those we saw impacted by recent storms in your state, Iowa, and other communities, and would agree that it has been important to have flexibility on things like hours of service in the context of those disasters. Now that you've raised this, I want to become more familiar with some of the areas of overlap or concern where more recent rulemakings could diminish flexibility on that, because we certainly leaned into that at many moments, notably including the Baltimore Bridge collapse, to try to provide some relief.
And I think we've got to, not listen, I get it. A lot of these independent and quasi-independent agencies, it's not like they work for the cabinet secretary. It's not like a memo comes out and they salute, and it's more complicated than that. They need to make their decisions based on an evidentiary record. Clearly, these decisions need to be abiding. They need to go to court and defend them. That's what's so surprising about this. I mean, the previous flexibility, the waiver authority for governors, allowed them a 30-day period. This is going to shorten it to 14. Keep in mind, the evidentiary record before the administration is that there hasn't been any particular abuse that they identified, and that there is no evidence that there's been a degradation of public safety because of a 30-day waiver period. And so to the extent we should have good decisions based on good data, I'm grateful for your commitment to dive in and better understand that situation. Let's go to permitting. This has been a consistent area of agreement that you and I have shared as you've appeared before the committee. I think in the couple of years you and I have been talking about this, we've made some progress. Let's be honest, it's modest progress. It is still, as you've talked about in your comments in the past, far, far more difficult to get a project cited in this country than it is in most every other developed nation. This is not an area of American excellence. I've had some success in working with my colleagues to advance a digital NEPA review, gotten that language in the aviation bill, yesterday in the water resources bill. I wanted to just touch base with you, sir, and see if your shop has been able to make any progress, particularly in the area of digital NEPA review and processing.
Thank you. Share your sense of urgency and interest here, and I would not challenge your assessment that while there's been progress, it has been modest. We have taken a number of steps to try to make the NEPA and permitting process more efficient. We've expanded a liaison program that can provide targeted assistance to project sponsors who would benefit from that. We've been doing more with programmatic agreements so that if multiple projects have similar characteristics, they can travel together, and we think we can cut some of the red tape that way. Specifically to your question about web-based digital, or sometimes e-NEPA is the term of art, we certainly see a lot of potential here. There's too much literal paperwork in the paperwork. One thing we've done to try to embrace that is a $750,000 modernizing NEPA challenge, knowing that some of the best ideas probably won't come from the building, but will come from around the country. That just launched in April, but we're looking forward to seeing the different ideas that come back from project sponsors there. And of course, we're working to maximize the use of categorical exclusions, which just bring a lot less of that process with them.
I do think categorical exclusions are a ripe area. I mean, we obviously make use of a lot of them, but I think there is so much more there. My closing comment, Mr. Secretary, would be at some point, you're just going to have a brainstorm, and maybe as you drift off to sleep or you're eating your Cheerios in the morning, of an idea that might be a little politically dangerous. It might upset people on your team or on my team, because let's get it. We both get it. The siting of large projects in this country is fraught with tremendous emotion and political peril. If you're looking for partners to advance your big, dangerous, but important idea, this committee is ready to work with you. Thanks.
I appreciate that and welcome that. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Auchincloss is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'll associate myself with my friend from South Dakota, both in his offer of partnership and in his compliments to your professionalism and responsiveness in your role. And I also want to say that your work in implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law has been critical, and I'll commend the Biden administration's efforts to quickly allocate the funds to our communities as well for maximum impact. I am seeing the difference in the suburbs of Boston in the ability of people to connect to jobs and services and improve standards of living. As Congress begins to think about the next surface transit reauthorization, I want to examine what additional tools Congress should be considering to finance transportation projects and to move away from an Eisenhower-era car-centric infrastructure system towards one that is focused on mobility holistically defined. While the recent reversal of New York's congestion pricing plan is extremely disappointing, it has nothing to say about the actual policy of congestion pricing itself. Congestion pricing allows cities to accurately reflect the cost of having cars in dense areas. Strong Towns has pointed out that this is not just a reflection of the negative externalities of air pollution, traffic, and emissions, but also allows cities to price in the space that vehicles take up. Manhattan has limited space for car traffic, and it should be allowed to reflect that scarcity through tolls and then use those revenues to fund things like transit and walkability improvements. Mr. Secretary, should Congress consider provisions in the next surface transportation reauthorization that would allow for additional flexibility for communities to price the externalities of driving as they see fit, including through congestion pricing and tolling?
I believe those flexibilities would be welcomed in communities around the country. As you noted, many of the true costs of the status quo are not reflected in the traditional models that we have. There may be a range of ways to take that on board through different forms, all of which we would like to be able to support to the extent statute allows us to.
Would you also encourage us to consider looking at the way that we fund highways versus transit, and to say the amount of federal dollars that are matched for highways being something like 80 to 20 versus transit at 50 to 50 and excluding operating costs?
I recognize and respect that a lot of this will probably be hashed out in the coming years as we move toward the next authorization, but certainly welcome any readiness to have a more holistic approach to pricing both the benefits and the costs associated with developing any mode of transportation, knowing that we've inherited a model where sometimes instead of a range of options, people were presented with one option, which was a car.
Right. Another way that Congress can finance better transportation operations and capital projects is by restoring employers' deductibility of transportation fringe benefits. I'm preparing bipartisan legislation that would make it cheaper and easier for businesses, especially small businesses, to offer transit benefits to their employees. This will help increase ridership, encourage commuters to shift transportation modes towards public transit and away from cars, and will do so without further subsidizing parking. Mr. Secretary, can you speak to the importance of incentivizing transit use through our tax code and how the private sector can encourage commuters to use public transit?
Well, to your prior point about externalities, there are so many benefits in terms of safety, congestion, affordability when people have an opportunity to use transit. I'd also note one of the things that we undertook toward the end of my tenure as mayor of my hometown of South Bend was a pilot covering those costs for employees, and employers reported back to us that the benefits in terms of less absenteeism and overtime from providing that kind of certainty through subsidy for workers' transportation costs was something that they wanted to double down on. I believe that much of this particular authority rests with Treasury, but we would consult with them and certainly be eager to consult with you on how to expand access to transportation and transit benefits for employees across the country.
Thank you. And I would just note that making owning a car an option rather than a requirement for younger people is an important way to reduce costs, right? You take a car and you drive it off the lot and it loses a third of its value, and it's really a depreciating asset ever after. Whereas you take that same amount of money and you can invest it, you can use it to invest in yourself. It's a way to build wealth. And at a time when people are really struggling with cost of living, making cars one of many options for them to get around, I think, is an important way to take some of that steam off. And I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Nels is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Good to see you, Mr. Secretary.
Afternoon.
16 months since East Palestine. Obviously, the NTSB report came out the other day. I've been placing close attention to it as I chair the Rails subcommittee here. And and I believe that she produced a very detailed report, and some of her findings, quite honestly, are very disturbing. One of the areas is that post-derailment actions. And when the American people saw this big bloom, this cloud above their city, the decision to vent and burn, and that procedure, according to the report, it appeared that Norfolk Southern made that decision. Apparently, they were able to, I don't want to say convince or get the incident commander to agree with that. The report appears that the NTSB said that Norfolk Southern compromised the integrity of that decision to vent and burn the tank cars by not communicating expertise and dissenting opinions. The justification, according to the report, is polymerization, which is that chemical reaction that could cause the explosion. So a point is that they said we have to do the vent and burn because we feel this thing could blow up. What are your thoughts on that? How would incident commanders allow them to do that when we had dissenting opinions?
One of the most troubling things in that report, I agree, was the finding that the vent and the polymerization that was feared by those who thought that by undertaking that vent and burn action, they were preventing an explosion, might not have actually occurred, meaning that the vent and burn did not have to happen. So certainly, while that will go to different parts of the decision chain than those that our department is directly involved with, we want to closely follow how NTSB's recommendations are taken on board, both in terms of how they apply to a railroad and how they apply to anybody in that incident command.
And I can understand it was in a rural area, first responders, many of them volunteers, driving to incidents in their pickup truck with bunker gear in the back. Maybe I don't want to say the skill set wasn't there, but they just didn't. If a derailment like that would have happened in the city of Houston or Boston or someplace, I don't think you would have burned it. You would have had a massive showing of logistical support with hazmat teams, this and that. But hey, in your testimony, I'm concerned about the railroad crossing elimination program. We know we have about 700 plus deaths a year as it relates to rail. And your testimony says it's improving or eliminating 400 rail crossings. In IJA, it's 500 million. My friend, I don't think that's enough. We need to do more. I mean, if that is a safety issue, we need to do more. What do you think we should do with that program?
If you'd like to propose growing that program, we'd love to work with you on it.
I will.
We've had our chance to go out to some of the first projects.
We're going to do
funding there. We announced it in North Dakota. The enthusiasm
We're going to do it
in communities is extraordinary, and I think it's so far been very well received.
How about the Ask Rail? What do you think about the Ask Rail? The report says, they didn't know what was in the cars. They didn't. The first responders didn't know the chemicals. They didn't know the consist in the cars. But the actual consist was up in the locomotive. But they didn't get it for a couple of hours. So here these first responders are out there trying to figure out what the hell's in these cars, and they didn't have it. Now, the Ask Rail, I think, is a good thing. I think all Class 1s use it, but we have to do something to make sure that we have the connectivity with cell service in these rural areas, because the Ask Rail app will be combat ineffective if we don't have it. One of the colleagues mentioned about the close call reporting system. I support it. I think it's a good idea. How do you think that, quickly, how do you think that will improve safety in our rail industry?
We think it creates one more opportunity to flag safety issues. We're glad to have a handful of participants, but we really believe it ought to be everybody. And
I agree.
Whether that's done by some kind of requirement through Congress or whether we all just continue pushing the Class 1s, I really hope we can get them.
Automated track inspection. Obviously, a lot of technology out there. I don't think a lot of people know about it. How can we, this is the tough side, how do we get labor and labor and the railroads together on the same page as it relates to these technologies? ATI is a great thing. I mean, it can do a lot.
I think a lot of the best technologies in the history of our economy have a track record of creating and expanding jobs, even if they change some of the aspects of what those jobs are like. But our posture is that and to be clear, we support and sometimes even ourselves use ATI. We just haven't seen the data that allows us to be confident that you can remove the human factor.
Sure. One quick thing. You support two-man crew?
We do.
Okay. Last one. The tank cars, the DOT 111s, the 105s, 117s. I don't know if everybody understands that, but we want to phase those out, right? The 111s by 2029. I think we can do it quicker. I would like to move that up, and I'll do everything I can to do that.
That is great news and one of the provisions we're most excited about in the pending bipartisan legislation.
All right, thank you.
The gentleman yields. Ms. Sykes is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Larson, for holding this hearing, and of course, Secretary Buttigieg, for your testimony. I'm certainly going to piggyback a little bit of my colleague and continue to talk about rail safety. As you know, the East Palestine trail derailment happened just next door to my district, and we have been very much involved and engaged. Since we've heard from the NTSB, we have penned a letter to this committee, including to Chairman Nails, to hold a hearing on rail safety. I've signed that letter with my colleague, Nikema Williams from Georgia, who is also very interested in making sure that we are holding corporate actors accountable and protecting the safety and security of people across the nation. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your efforts in supporting bipartisan rail safety provisions and many of the things that we just heard about. I also want to say thank you for visiting Ohio's 13th district, the best district, of course, in the nation, as we all say, to highlight some of the local efforts to create workforce development opportunities, expand apprenticeships, and invest in infrastructure to lower costs. And none of these would be possible without the historic legislation like the bipartisan infrastructure law and the implementation work that you have done. We're very grateful for those funds that have made it to our communities, and a lot of people have gotten great jobs, union jobs especially, that pay well and are safe. But one thing that we didn't get to do in the district during your visit this week was visit our crown jewel, which we call the Akron-Canton Airport, which is CAK. They have received over $3 million in funding, and this airport was established during World War II and served as a vital asset for economic development in the community, and generated over $1 billion in the area and over 4,000 jobs. However, even with this type of activity and ridership, passenger rides, it has not protected this airport from threats faced by other small to mid-sized regional airports. So for example, CAK has seen major airlines consolidate their routes to Cleveland Hopkins, in part because CAK is designated within the Cleveland Airport as one market based on the Department of Transportation. And this designation has unfairly excluded CAK from the list of airports that require maximum air service levels and limits their ability to optimize their role as a key promoter of economic development. And this directly impacts my constituents because these were their jobs that now have moved. So, Mr. Secretary, how can airports like Akron-Canton distinguish itself as a unique standalone market when some of the decisions by agencies don't allow them to do so?
Well, first, let me thank you for welcoming us to the district. It was a very informative and inspiring visit. And also, let me thank you for your work on rail safety legislation that we are very hopeful gets quick action and results in this chamber. Having been the mayor of a city that had a small airport that was within driving distance of a big airport but meant a lot to our community, I certainly understand and sympathize with the aspirations of Akron-Canton and want to make sure that airport gets the support that it needs and deserves. I know that we've been in dialogue with the airport about planned upgrades for the air traffic control tower there, but also understand that there is a level of market pressure that's affecting the region. While some of the ways that these radii are set up may be pursuant to statute, to the extent there's any flexibility, we'd welcome opportunities to work with you on that so that it really makes sense for the region, for the market, and for a community or a facility like Akron-Canton.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We have felt the downside of the consolidations and larger airports, larger airlines, going way back to U.S. Air, American Airlines, when we had Northwest, Delta, even with full flights, loyal customers, and large populations based close to our airport, and really a segment of our rural communities really preferring this route. It has been very, very impactful. And so, again, we just want to work with you on that very specific need in our community. We do not want to see this airport go away. It would be negatively impact not just Northeast Ohio, my district, but the entire eastern region of the state that certainly needs a lot of love. But with that, Mr. Secretary, I promised you when you were in the district that we were going to be very positive and give you good vibes, because I do know that this can be tough sitting in meetings for several hours, and I'm going to yield back my final 13 seconds so you can take a breath. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative.
The gentlewoman yields. Mr. Mann is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here again today. I represent 60 primary rural counties in central, western Kansas, a little bit eastern as well. In Kansas, we know full well that it's imperative that our highways and roads are drivable, that commercial and cargo aviation are able to efficiently operate, and that our railroads are able to deliver goods and provide the transportation that we all need. A handful of questions, Mr. Secretary. America, as you know, we have 5,000 commercial-grade airports, yet only 500 of these airports are currently served by commercial services. Around the country, we've seen a steady decline in air services, with more than 150 communities losing air service in the last 20 years. In rural Kansas, this issue is all too real. FAA Administrator Whitaker has emphasized the need for regional aircraft with a capacity between 9 and 50 seats to better serve these smaller communities, and mentioned plans to prioritize manufacturing efforts for such aircraft. How do you envision new generation regional aircraft helping to restore regional air service, and what plans does DOT have to accelerate the production of smaller regional aircraft in the country?
Well, thanks for the question, and certainly can relate to the perspective of a community served by a small airport, wondering whether there's a future for commercial air service there. And part of what I think is compelling about the FAA's most recent work is how it might be able to open up new opportunities in that kind of sandwiched category between one size of aircraft and the next that's a step up. Of course, our primary imperative has to do with safety. That'll guide everything that the FAA does. But we also want to make sure we're paying attention to the economic dimensions of that, to the extent that we're permitted to do that through some of the authorities that we have on the OST side of the house. And we make sure that our team works alongside the FAA safety folks, because we've seen what EAS has done and can do for support of air service to small communities and rural areas, but we also see there's much more need than has been supported by the resources that we have.
And we got to keep delivering aircraft in the certain size that's going to make these smaller airports continue to be viable, as I see it. Next question, Mr. Secretary. In my mind, it's imperative that we maintain our nation's highways and roads so our economies and supply chains can thrive. I think we all agree on that. As has been mentioned earlier today, electric batteries are far heavier than car batteries, and no doubt these heavier vehicles are going to lead to more wear and tear on our roads quicker than gas-powered cars. Has the DOT considered how its electric vehicle mandates might impact our roads, or offered any thoughts on how these vehicles will pay their fair share when it comes to contributing to the Highway Trust Fund?
Well, if the DOT were ever to contemplate an electric vehicle mandate, we would do so. Since we have not, I wouldn't phrase it that way, but that's not to take away from the fact that we're conscious of the fact that the increasing use of EVs comes with increasingly heavy vehicles. By the way, so has consumer choice evolving more toward SUVs and trucks relative to what you would have seen 10, 20, 30 years ago, whether we're talking about combustion or EVs. And this brings me to one of my favorite, though admittedly unfashionable topics, which is pavement durability. I'd encourage you to, if you get the opportunity, to visit our Turner Fairbanks facility operated by the Federal Highway Administration, not too far from where we're sitting here. And I was able to see a test bed we have there where there are 12 seemingly identical strips of asphalt next to each other. But if you dig beneath the surface, literally, what you would find is different makeup, different composite, different stacking, and about 300 sensors that are helping beam real-time information about how they weather the different conditions they're subject to. In terms of the other side of your question about funding, we're conscious that as we move toward an increasingly electric future, the gas tax model will not be sufficient to capture the principle of user pays, nor has it been sufficient for some time just to keep pace with demand. I think by the time of the next reauthorization, Congress and the country really will face a choice about whether to remain committed to the user pays principle, in which case there will have to be some revenue source that can equitably collect from EVs the same way that if you have a gas car, you're paying the gas tax, or be willing to set aside that principle, which in a way is happening de facto with the portion of the Highway Trust Fund that's being gapped with general fund dollars coming from Congress. But I don't think that's a considered decision. I think it's just a measure Congress has had to undertake in order to make ends meet.
Great, yeah. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time. Thanks, Mr. Secretary.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Skolton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for taking the time to be here today. This must be the Regional Air Service portion of the hearing. So the Department of Transportation's EAS program, of course, plays such a vital role in ensuring communities have access to air travel provided by certified air carriers. I'm fortunate to have two great airports in my district. The one I want to ask about today is Muskegon County Airport, MKG. Their EAS provider has not met the needs of the community with documented poor operational reliability, widespread concerns regarding the customer experience, and failure to meet the terms of its contract. To quantify this poor performance, MKG, their current EAS provider's actual completion rate sits below 70%. 68% of those completed flights were delayed significantly. Due to a lack of confidence across Muskegon, at the end of 2023, MKG requested a change in its EAS provider, which I fully support. Despite the Muskegon County Commissioners and my support for a new EAS provider, as well as a non-objection letter from the current provider, the department has yet to complete its contract to ensure that folks can access reliable, quality flights in and out of this vital part of the lakeshore. Does the department's EAS and Domestic Analysis Division have the resources that it needs to address these contract changes? We obviously can't do it without the department sign-off. If not, can you speak to where these delays might be coming in?
Well, thank you. I know that we have a small and hard-working team seeking to keep up with the demand for processing of all of these EAS applications and developments. So I will commit to learning more about the Muskegon application and anything that can be done to move it along. As far as resources, we, again, have a small but mighty team. They do a great job with the resources that they have, but we'd welcome opportunities, not just in terms of the administrative side, but just more generally to make sure that EAS is robust so that it can meet the needs of these smaller communities that need and deserve good commercial air service.
Thank you. Appreciate your attention to that matter. On to my next question. We're both proud Michiganders now, and we know that Michigan put the world on wheels, and we are going to keep it moving forward. A big way in which we do that is through the trucking industry. Close to 250,000 jobs in Michigan are the trucking industry supports 250,000 jobs, and 1 out of every 15 jobs is considered a trucking job in the state of Michigan. These individuals work long hours, risk their safety to ensure supply chains run smoothly. Unfortunately, an ongoing shortage of safe and accessible truck parking throughout the country threatens the safety of all drivers. I know we touched on this earlier in the hearing as well. It's incumbent on us here in Congress to fix this, which is why I'm such a proud co-sponsor of my colleague, Mr. Boss' Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act, which advanced out of committee this past year. Mr. Secretary, I understand that while some IIJA dollars were directed towards truck parking funds, these funds were not specifically dedicated for that use, leaving state transportation departments to choose between pursuing truck parking and critical infrastructure projects. Given these pressing needs, how is the department planning to address this gap and provide the necessary resources to keep truckers and everyday drivers safe?
Let me first applaud your attention to the issue of truck parking. It is far and away the #1 thing we hear whenever I'm with drivers and trucking organizations. As you noted, we have a number of projects going on across the country, but none of them come from a program or a fund that is dedicated for that purpose. So whether it's a scenario like you described where a state is making tough choices about what to prioritize, or our own discretionary grant-making processes where I'm very keen to make sure we support truck parking, but that is competing with every other worthy cause coming in. It would be different if there were specific dedicated funding for that, and we'd welcome working with you on that bipartisan legislation to make sure that that there are more resources than before going to this clear and mounting need, which, by the way, is not just a convenience issue for drivers, but really a safety issue for everybody.
It absolutely is for the drivers and pedestrians, the truck drivers themselves, others who encounter them. We'll absolutely continue doing everything we can in Congress to allocate that funding, but of course the Department of Transportation has the ability to specifically designate that as well, and just want to thank you for your attention there.
Thank you.
I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and the gentleman from the great state of Utah, Mr. Owens, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Mr. Secretary. Thanks for being here. I'm going to start with something very Utah-specific, and thank you for the collaboration we have right now with federal. The state of Utah is the fastest-growing state in the union over the past decade, with over 80% of our population along a 100-mile stretch of I-15 between the Wasatch Mountain Range and the Great Salt Lake. Utah and I was also preparing to host for the 2034 Winter Olympic Games. With the growth, it is imperative to have a safe, efficient, and reliable public transportation system to maintain the high quality that we now have in this region. Projects like the double tracking Utah's front-runner commuter rail systems are key to addressing traffic congestion, air quality, and affordable housing. The double tracking system is projected to double the ridership and double the frequency of trains. The state of Utah has provided over $400 million to this project and now seeking a collaborative federal partnership to complete this critically important regional project. The project is now currently in developmental stage with FTA's capital investment grant, and I'm pleased to see that, that this project was listed on the President's most recent budget request. Can you affirm that the administration's commitment to continuing working with Utah to get the front-runner strategic double tracking project approved into the engineering phase this year?
Absolutely. FTA has allocated $494 million to date in CIG funding for this. We've worked closely with Utah's DOT, and we applaud their attention to growing transit needs in, as you mentioned, a very fast-growing area that's really going to require and benefit from those kinds of investments. With every major project, there are challenges to be met. We want to meet those challenges together, and we anticipate an entry into engineering, pending, of course, various requirements that have to be met, but we anticipate that in the year ahead, and would love to be able to celebrate this entering into revenue service.
Well, thanks for that. And I'll just say this, Utah is the most innovative. We come under budget, we balance our budget, so continue to use us as an example for the rest of the country. I think we'll all be well served. So thanks so much for that. We'll switch topics real quickly. I am concerned whenever government solutions become highlighted more than the free market. And I'm fear that we're repeating a mistake that we made in the past when we led a worldwide blind eye to man's humanity demand. We're talking about back in the day when something as simple as the cotton gin was a game changer. Before the cotton gin, slavery was just not a profitable venture. It was too labor intensive. It could not scale. The cotton gin allowed it to scale unlimited as long as they had the pickers, and those pickers were slaves. It took 72 years and over 600,000 lives to change that trajectory. My concern right now is EVs are dependent on Congo, the cobalt that's produced in these mines. The UN has come up with a report that over 40,000 children as young as 6 years old are being used in these mines. I would call that slave labor because children do not want to do that on their own. And my concern again is that we're out of sight, out of mind. We allow man's natural avarice to greed to put in place our goals as opposed to what might be getting to make that happen. So here's my question. How does the administration justify the use of taxpayers' subsidy for this type of environment in which so many children are being used for labor?
In order to save American lives, but to be clear, we do not tolerate child labor or forced labor.
Just real quickly, you said in order to save American lives?
Yes, there is no justification for, of course, for child labor or forced labor. But if you're asking the justification for our enthusiasm for EVs, it is to save American lives and in order to prevent forced labor or child labor from going into any of our supply chains. Cobalt is one of the 159 products listed by the Department of Labor.
I need to just ask that question because I'm having a little trouble digesting that. You're saying to build EVs and using child labor is saving American lives?
No, of course not. Nobody's saying that anything brought into the United States should include forced labor or child labor. This is one of the reasons why we've acted to reduce the extent to which cobalt is included. As a matter of fact, we believe that 80% less cobalt is now going into today's EV batteries, and we're encouraged to see developments that might drive that even lower. But if you want to know why we believe it is important to adopt electric vehicles, part of the reason has to do with the 29,000 American deaths associated with pollution every year.
I apologize. I ran out of time. I'm so sorry for that. I just want to say this. We're now representing what this cotton gin represented back 200 years ago. We are the impetus. We're allowing this to be scaled, China and the United States. We need to let the free market work so innovation come in. We'll figure out a much better way of doing it, and Americans will decide whether they want to buy, not on subsidy, but based on all the areas, all these factors that factor into to developing this industry. With that, I yield back, and I'm sorry I ran out of time there.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Fushi is recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. Fushi, sorry.
Thank you to the chairman and the ranking member for holding this hearing today. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. We realize your time is valuable, and I'm sure I can speak for my colleagues that we appreciate you appearing before the committee today to speak about the important work that the Department of Transportation is doing across the country. As I brought up in our rail subcommittee hearing earlier this month, 2023 was a remarkable year for North Carolina passenger rail. Thanks. Amtrak ridership in the state saw a staggering year-over-year increase of 33.7%. We received a number of corridor ID grants to further build out 7 different rail corridors throughout the state. And North Carolina's S-Line project was awarded over $1 billion via the federal-state partnership for intercity passenger rail to help us design and build a high-performance passenger rail line connecting North Carolina and Virginia. So from your vantage point at DOT, can you speak to the ways in which the investments from BIL have spurred the growth and development of passenger rail in regions of the country like the Southeast Corridor, where communities have historically lacked access to passenger rail as a legitimate transportation alternative?
Well, thank you. I'm enthusiastic about the creation of opportunity for passenger rail and seeing how that has benefited the North Carolina and the Southeast corridors. I think a prime example of how the bipartisan infrastructure law is allowing us to transform our nation's rail network. Amtrak set a record for ridership last year in North Carolina, surpassed 1 million riders for the first time, which also brings it all the way back and on track to exceed all of the pre-COVID numbers that we had seen. And as you mentioned, that $1 billion grant to develop a new passenger rail route between Raleigh and Richmond, we think is going to bring enormous opportunity. I want to emphasize that we think that's just the beginning of the corridor development we can do, both with conventional and, in the future, we think high-speed rail opportunities, because we don't see any reason why Americans should have any less access to excellent passenger rail than people living in any other developed country.
And I'm sure you're aware passenger and freight railroads have recently begun testing AI-enhanced camera portal technologies for rail car inspections. And while this technology has the potential to increase the effectiveness of inspections and the overall level of safety in our rail system, I'm concerned that railroads won't be utilizing properly trained personnel to review the data these AI-enhanced technologies generate. In the rail industry, there are qualified mechanical inspectors whose sole jobs are to make sure rail cars are inspected and safe when departing a rail yard. It is imperative that AI-enhanced technology be tested by these inspectors and that the results of the AI-facilitated inspections be reported to qualified inspectors to ensure that appropriate corrective actions are being taken when safety defects in rail cars are identified. Can you speak generally about how the department is reviewing and evaluating new rail technology like this in light of the DOT's innovation principles? And more specifically, can you commit to having DOT review the use of this technology in rail yards to ensure that qualified mechanical inspectors are being appropriately utilized to review the data that's being produced?
Thank you. Yes, we are committed to ensuring we maintain the high standards that our department enforces for the expert-led inspection and quality assurance that keeps our railroads safe. There are certainly any number of new technologies that can help with that. We welcome the development of new technologies, but we don't view that as a replacement for what we now have given the data that we've seen. Nor do we think it represents an excuse to lower our standard when it comes to what we expect of our railroads. So we'll continue to support and evaluate research on different forms of technology for things like track inspection and other safety and quality control functions, but there is no substitute for the human expertise that has gone in so many ways toward keeping our railroads safe, and we'll continue to work with those who've spent their lives on this important domain of rail safety as we look to the future.
Agreed. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Yackham is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and Mr. Secretary. It's good to see you again. I want to discuss two IJA programs, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI, and the Charging Fueling Infrastructure, or CFI programs. As you know, NEVI was funded at $5.5 billion and CFI at $2.5 billion. After 2.5 years, it appears that just the 9th NEVI-funded EV charging station was brought online this month in Pennsylvania. A few weeks ago, I asked FHWA Administrator Batt how many NEVI funding charging stations he expects to have brought online in 2024. He said he expects it to be in the, quote, hundreds to thousands range brought online this year. Do you agree with his estimate?
Yes, the bulk of the NEVI chargers will be installed in 2027 and 2028, but I have been impressed to see that some of them will actually come online this year, 2024, and a few of them have even already been installed.
So you do expect hundreds, if not thousands?
Yeah, I think the first...
by the end of this year.
Right, like I said, 27, 28 is when you're going to see most of the installations, but I expect the first few hundred to come online this year.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn our attention to CFI. That $2.5 billion program has brought in 0 charging stations online in the last 2.5 years because the first grants were only announced in January of 2024. Now, I'm happy to report that one of those recipients is the Michiana Area Council of Governments, or MACOG, as I know you're familiar with in your old stomping grounds. But I think their experience is perhaps emblematic of why NEVI and CFI have fallen a bit flat on their face out of the blocks, because 5 months after the announcement, MACOG still doesn't have a fully executed grant agreement, and of course, no work can start until that's in place. Mr. Secretary, of the 47 CFI awards announced in January of 2024, how many grant agreements have been finalized?
I doubt that it's been possible to do grant agreements on most of them that quickly. It's not typical, especially on a brand new program, to do them on anything close to a 5-month time frame. I'm impatient to do them, but I just want to make sure nobody moves the goalpost here for a program that we expect will do the bulk of its work in the second half of this decade.
Do you know how many have been completed? Is it 0? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it?
I'd have to pull that, but I would not expect any of them to be done yet.
Okay. I mean, it's a little bit disappointing that you wouldn't know the answer, because I did give your staff a heads up that we'd be asking that question here. And I do believe that slow grant agreements certainly seem to be a hallmark of the Biden administration's what seems to be kind of the build nothing ever agenda. As most recent report on IJA raise grants shows that only 118 of the 415 grant agreements have been executed, which certainly is at a time of high inflation, and these delays certainly serve to bust budgets and put projects in jeopardy. So when would you expect all 47 of the original grant agreements to be executed?
We can only certify a grant agreement if it actually meets federal requirements, so I can't guarantee on behalf of any project sponsor when they'll be ready. What I can guarantee is that we'll work with them to get ready, but we can only certify that something meets federal law if it's actually true. I also respectfully think you are mistaken to characterize this timing as delayed, especially given that it's the same general time to grant agreement as we saw in the previous administration. That's not to say I don't want it to be faster. I just want to make sure we're being honest about the patterns that we've inherited when it comes to how long it takes to get from an award announcement to a grant agreement, especially when we're talking about a novel program.
What do you believe the general target should be for new grant agreements to be put in place?
So again, it really depends on what kind of project. For example, if MACOG were to come to us, they said they want to do an interchange, they're hoping to get it to construction by 2027. we may recognize that if they're not ready to have the pieces in place for a grant agreement until 2026, that might be workable. Whereas for another program where they want to be running in the next construction season, we're going to want them to turn that quickly. But it is extremely rare, and I mean extremely rare, for any project to lapse past the obligation deadline set by Congress.
Thank you. The most recent quarterly NEVI update showed that there are now 183,000 publicly available charging ports. How many of those were built by the federal government?
Those are built by the private sector.
Yeah. So with those being built by the private sector, and the most recent NEVI quarterly report showing that we've got 37 charging ports out of 183,000 built by the government, do you believe that there's still an appropriate role for the federal government to play here, given the fact that the private sector is doing so well in building these charging ports? Shouldn't the federal government pull back and just get out of the business?
No, we think it's really important to fill in some of the gaps in areas that won't pencil for the private sector. Look, the vast majority of EV charging takes place at home, but having those public chargers out there is going to be important, and it's been very clear from our research that the private sector alone won't reach some of the areas, whether we're talking about low-income areas, rural areas that are spread out. They just don't pencil. That's why Congress created this program, which is designed to create tens of thousands of chargers in the second half of this decade. But I'm pleased to see the very first handful of them already online.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Mr. DeLuzio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, good to see you here today. I'll start with a bit of thanks. Was very excited to hear the department and you, Mr. Secretary, select Sharpsburg in my district for a competitive raise grant, $25 million. I know you heard from me and the department heard from me on this. A big deal for my region, a big deal for Sharpsburg, so thank you. Turning to rail safety, which I'm sure is no surprise, I've been very encouraged today to hear colleagues on both sides of the aisle express support for rail safety, for some common sense measures to make freight rail safer, to protect communities like mine. Appreciated yours and the administration's strong support of the Railway Safety Act. Was very encouraged to hear Subcommittee Chair Nels express some support there. Look forward to working with him and others to get something done. It's been more than a year since the East Palestine derailment, Norfolk Southern's train. My constituents, many within the evacuation zone, affected in their homes, farms. Certainly our neighbors in Ohio bear much of the cost of this as well. Many still dealing with the uncertainty around the safety of their air, their soil, their animals, water. We've got the NTSB findings now. I know we've had some discussion here today. Chair Homendy has talked about at length the main cause, of course, being overheated wheel bearing and faulty detectors on the tracks. What shocked me, and we've heard some reports of this before the findings, was Norfolk Southern and its contractors withholding information from first responders, the incident commander on the ground, specifically information from the manufacturer of the chemicals, who was telling Norfolk Southern and its contractors that, in fact, they were not at risk of explosion, those cars. The cars were more modern and thus able to withstand what had happened. And in fact, were cooling. That information was not conveyed to the folks on the ground. They were pressured, in my opinion, to authorize the vent and burn, which sent a toxic fireball over the sky of my constituents and our neighbors in Ohio, imperiling their health. I find it unacceptable. It didn't need to happen, and I think the question is why. It seems to me the railroad wanted to get the trains moving again, putting their profit, their lust for profit above the safety of my constituents. So I'll ask a very simple question, Mr. Secretary, to start. Do you trust the railroads to regulate themselves?
Absolutely not.
Me neither. I think what we saw in this derailment and in conduct thereafter is they cannot be trusted. I think we have a bipartisan path forward. I think what also reinforces that need for us to take bold action here is what Chair Homendy said about the railroad interfering with the investigation, what she said was an unprecedented and reprehensible way. I think it speaks to a lack of commitment to public safety, a thirst for profit that's unending. And of course, some in Congress have said that, well, we have to wait for the final NTSB findings to act. We have those. I think that excuse is gone. I'm excited to see that there are folks here in both parties who want to work together to get this done. The Railway Safety Act, as you know, I think may be the only piece of legislation that Joe Biden and Donald Trump agree about. This ought to be an easy thing for this committee to work on. You mentioned two legislative actions specifically from the findings, one being caps on fines. the railroads pay. Currently, I think it's around $225,000. The Railway Safety Act increases that tremendously to 1% of railroads' annual operating income. So the bill addresses that point. And then another piece, which you've mentioned, I heard Chairman Nels also express support about, increasing or accelerating the upgrade timeline for tank cars. We have these provisions. We can get this done. I'd urge my colleagues to support me in doing that. Give you a chance, Mr. Secretary. Plenty of things you and the department are doing around rail safety, but you need help from Congress. What else do you need us to do?
We need this legislation. Look, we're doing everything we can short of an act of Congress, but we're urgently calling for Congress to act, because legislation like the legislation you have put forward will give our department a stronger hand to hold railroads accountable and to keep our railroads safe. We're talking about an extremely, some would say ridiculously profitable industry. They have the means to operate more safely, but unless a law requires it of them, it will not happen. I believe the provisions that we've talked about, like the increased fines, acceleration of the adoption of stronger tank cars, as well as measures that would enhance the handling and the flow of information about hazardous materials, are going to save lives. And the moment Congress gets that action through this chamber and the Senate, where of course the committee in the Senate has already heard it, we will get to work right away implementing that.
Very good. We'll do our best here, sir. I encourage my colleagues to join me on this. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Kane is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here today. This hearing could not have come at a better time, at least for my constituents in New Jersey. Mr. Secretary, as you know, during this past week, the Northeast Corridor, particularly between New York Penn Station and Newark, saw major delays due to a myriad of issues, some related to power challenges, potentially outdated infrastructure, and system failures. Not only have these major delays and cancellations become all too regular, but are now with 16 such incidences within the last 6 weeks alone. Just last week, I wrote to Amtrak CEO Stephen Gardner requesting information and remedies for recent delays and cancellations. Today, I was informed that Amtrak and New Jersey Transit have reached an agreement to investigate these issues, and I'm reviewing that agreement now. Additionally, I, along with my colleagues in the New Jersey delegation, sent you a letter this week requesting an investigation into the failures along the affected section of the Northeast Corridor. And I hope that my colleagues and I will receive a response soon. Because of these regular delays prevent working parents from attending their children's sporting events and missing cherished family dinners. I look forward to working with you and your team on fixing these important issues. Mr. Secretary, the commuter railroads that operate up and down the Northeast Corridor, New Jersey Transit, Long Island Railroad, and Metro North, SEPTA in Philadelphia, and others, all have board of directors meetings that are open to the public so that the public can see the decisions that affect them are being made and so they can give their input to leaders directly. Still, Amtrak's board meetings are not open to the public. Mr. Secretary, would you support Amtrak becoming like the other railroads and holding open public meetings?
I haven't had a chance to evaluate what effect that would have on Amtrak's governance. Obviously, they operate by different requirements than a government entity because of their quasi-government role. But certainly agree that a high level of transparency is important in how a corporation of that public importance conducts its business.
Could you please investigate that and get back to me directly in writing what your opinions are on that? And because I think it's very important, and I agree with you, the more transparency for everybody involved in this, especially those people who are subject to any decisions of any board of directors, needs to be public. Thank you. Increased funding for Amtrak has allowed the agency to hire a significant number of employees in the last few years. How many employees has Amtrak hired for key operational functions such as flagging, track and tie repair, and electric traction repair?
Sorry, the question is?
How many employees has Amtrak hired for key operational functions such as flagging, track and tie repair, and electric traction repair?
I don't have a tabulation of hires by employee category handy, but I'd be happy to request one from Amtrak on your behalf if you'd have trouble getting that.
Thank you. How is USDOT ensuring that Amtrak is investing in positions that actually do improve day-to-day operations?
Well, ultimately, it's a question of performance, and we want to make sure that Amtrak is meeting the performance marks that are expected of them, whether we're talking about on-time performance, maintenance issues, or their fiscal condition. Certainly seen a lot of improvement on the fiscal side in terms of them moving their operating numbers closer to break even or into the black pre-COVID, and would encourage them to continue that work. But also in very specific ways, we fund, mainly on the capital side, their operations in order to make, or their growth in order to make sure they have the equipment they need. I was concerned to see the recent mark from the House cut funding for Amtrak. I think they're working with resources that are sometimes spread thin, but working toward a very important mission as they do so.
As you know, I support Amtrak and continued service, and we need to have more stops, as we've discussed in the past, in Trenton as well as in Metro Park and throughout the entire Northeast Corridor in New Jersey. How specifically do you ensure that Amtrak's internal processes prioritize day-to-day operations from the top down?
Well, it's certainly something that we communicate in our engagements with Amtrak, the desire for a focus on results for the end user. I know they're balancing a lot of competing priorities in terms of their capital needs, operations and maintenance, and their vision for the future. But we know that one of the biggest obstacles to Amtrak's reliability has been underinvestment, and we believe that the historic investment we're making through the President's infrastructure package is helping them to get ahead of that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Norton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, we have recently seen overall traffic fatalities start to decrease, but fatalities of vulnerable road users, such as pedestrians and bicyclists, continue to rise. Under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, Congress required states to complete vulnerable road user safety assessments. The law also required states with high rates of pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities to dedicate a portion of their highway safety funds to stopping these needless deaths. What is the department learning from the implementation of these provisions, and what else is needed to reduce pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities?
Well, thank you for the question. Like you, we've been heartened to see improvements in the overall numbers of roadway fatalities over the last 8 quarters in the U.S., but we continue to see very troubling patterns in terms of pedestrian and cyclist injuries and fatalities or vulnerable road users. Part of what we've been able to do about it is through our Safe Streets and Roads for All program to help communities, including those undertaking the assessments you've described, implement plans that better protect vulnerable road users from exposure to traffic. I fear sometimes that media or other accounts of things like bike lanes treat them as ornamental when they are really about life safety. And whether we're talking about bike lanes, lighting, signage, or other measures, many of the things that we're now able to fund in hundreds of communities across the country are, we believe, contributing toward a safer environment for pedestrians, cyclists, and other vulnerable road users to go about their commute, their trip, whatever they're doing, without harm.
Mr. Secretary, last fall, the department issued guidance on how 2 loan programs, TIFIA and RIF, can be used to support transit-oriented development, including conversions of unused office space to new housing, which is particularly needed in the District of Columbia, which I represent. Has the department authorized any federal funds for office conversion projects And how can we get more funds out the door?
We've got a number of those in the pipeline, and our first transit-oriented development loan was closed in April, the Mount Vernon, Washington Library Commons project, which is now under construction. We're very hopeful that this program will lead to support for those conversions you were describing. Post-COVID commuting patterns are changed, and the mix of what different cities require in terms of housing versus commercial square footage is different. We want to make sure we're helping them make use of opportunities to do those conversions, knowing the housing crunch that so many communities face. We can't predict a definite timeline for when some of the other applicants will be ready, but we are working through a number of applications as we speak. We'd be happy to keep you apprised of the development of that new pipeline in the TOD funding.
I want to discuss the importance of strengthening consumer protection in transportation. This past April, the department issued a final rule requiring aircraft carriers to provide automatic refunds when airlines cancel or significantly change their flights. I recently introduced the Household Goods Shipping Consumer Protection Act with Representative Ezell to give the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration more authority to protect consumers from fraud in the interstate transportation of household goods. The Federal Motor Carrier Transportation Safety Administration receives thousands of complaints every year from Americans who are victims of fraud in the shipment of household goods. And my bill would grant the agency the authority to reimburse states for enforcing federal consumer protection laws related to the transportation of household goods and to assess civil penalties against unregistered shippers against entities that hold consumer personal goods. What other steps is the department taking to strengthen consumer protection in transportation, Mr. Secretary?
We see how fraud in the movement of goods has created just gut-wrenching stories from people who are vulnerable when somebody else has possession of their goods during a move. So FMCSA has increased its efforts to combat external fraud relating to commercial motor vehicle and driver operations. Legislation such as what you have led on introducing could give FMCSA the explicit authority needed to assess civil penalties for violations of commercial regulations, withhold registration from applicants who have failed to provide the right verification demonstrating that they are legitimate, and allow us to expand our household good program by engaging states as force multipliers. So we welcome this and appreciate your work on it.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Secretary Buttigieg, you have recently, just earlier today, you've answered a lot of questions related to the slow implementation of the EV charging stations. And one of the conversations that you had, I thought was concerning, and I want to kind of touch upon it, was the statement that this push towards electric vehicles, even though there's a cost of slave labor, and that we're seeing, and it's not just cobalt, we've got lithium and other items that are being supplied by 90% of it is coming from China. So we're empowering someone who's an aggressor to the United States, and yet you're saying that it's fine so long as we're saving lives in America.
That's not an accurate characterization of what I've said. We wish you would have supported us in moving more of this onshore so it'd be produced in America, but the legislation did pass. And to take graphite alone, we're going to be able to supply, we estimate, 47% of it domestically. Nobody believes in allowing any product that doesn't meet labor standards to be imported to the United States. And if you'd like to work with us on making sure any of the 159 items of concern to include cobalt can be better enforced, we'd welcome that.
Your view that it saves lives.
We believe that preventing harmful pollution, well, we don't believe, it is a fact that preventing harmful pollution in the U.S. will save lives.
Have you done any calculations, given the current rate of fires that occur, and these fires, as reports indicate, take hundreds of thousands of liters of water to extinguish when an electric vehicle catches fire? Do you have any research that indicates how many people might die from some of these fires?
I haven't seen a projection of that. I'm sure you're aware that flammable liquids are also a safety concern, and either way, we work to make sure that they are handled in a safe fashion.
We're not seeing the reports of vehicles, like an epidemic of regular gasoline vehicles catching fire.
You're not?
Across the United States.
You've never heard of gasoline
Does
fires
it
in
take
vehicles?
150,000 liters of water to put out?
Are you familiar with what happened to the I-95 bridge? Let me assure you that the use of flammable liquids to propel hundreds of millions of vehicles includes hazards. Let me also make you aware that the American Chemical Society estimates that 9,700 Americans a year die from the pollution associated with passenger vehicle use in this country.
Let me ask this question. There's been reports of individuals who have been locked in an electric vehicle. There was a recent story. Renee Sanchez found her 20-month-old granddaughter stuck in an electric vehicle in the heat. The battery had died, and they couldn't get the child out. They had to call and get firefighters to come break the glass in order to get the child out. Just recently, last year, Secretary Granholm had an embarrassing incident where she had a PR tour that went south, was promoting electric vehicles and that push, driving across the country in electric vehicles. Apparently, she had an advance team that was in a gas-powered vehicle. That advance team occupied the charging station, the one charging station that a family needed, causing who had an infant, that family to have to call 911 so that they could make sure that they were able to provide some kind of care for their infant child in that heat.
I imagine you're aware that the number of publicly available chargers has nearly doubled since we took office, and we're investing to fill in the gaps. Now, 80% plus of charging happens at home, but for the rest of it, that's where those public chargers are so important. But we've just never been the kind of country that holds on to old technology because we're working on problems with the new technology.
Point, the American people are seeing what's happening, and they have serious concerns, and yet we're pushing ever more in this direction. And I don't know that we're actually taking into consideration the human costs that these are also bringing with them. The potential for batteries to die, people to be stranded in places without air conditioning, without support. And I would think that your administration would want to have those facts as well. How many people might die because of fires occurring from these batteries?
A battery dying is a problem, just like running out of gas is a problem, which is why we're investing in addressing that. I've just never thought of that as an excuse to hang on to dirty and expensive fuels and old technology.
Well, the American people disagree. They do.
Well, no, the American people disagree with you because every year they buy more EVs.
No,
why do you think they're buying more EVs every year than before?
Because it was present the numbers, because every...
Sure, 1.2 million vehicles were purchased last year, and every single
how many
quarter...
of them were government?
How's that?
How many of them were purchased by the government?
Approximately 0.5%.
Of the number, you're saying...
Of the EVs, about 0.5% were purchased by the federal government.
The only reason why people are buying them is because of the subsidy.
Well, the subsidy makes them more affordable and helps people buy them. That's true.
My time has expired. Recognize Mr. Johnson from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Great to see you. And you arrived at my doorstep on a high as far as electric vehicles are concerned. I want you to continue on this streak that you are on right now, explaining why it's important that our economy lead in terms of adopting new forms of clean, renewable energy, automobiles representing a big part of that. Would you, I want to open the floor to you to kind of talk about why we're heading in this direction, why it's important that we continue to do so.
I appreciate the question, and I want to emphasize part of why I care so much about this is that I grew up in northern Indiana, the industrial Midwest, and the home of what had been the Studebaker Car Company, which went out of business 20 years before I was born. And that meant that I grew up surrounded by crumbling and decaying factories that were a consequence of our automotive economy in our part of the Midwest not keeping up with the most recent and necessary processes and technologies. So I know what's at stake economically for our country in terms of the importance of us leading the EV market instead of finding excuses to hold on to dirty and expensive fuels and old technology for as long as humanly possible. I also appreciate the opportunity to return to one of the important dimensions of the exchange I was just having with Representative Burleson, which is life safety. ACS data suggests that 29,000 deaths per year are attributable to human-caused domestic omissions, including 7,700 from truck use and 9,700 from passenger vehicle use. We have a chance to change that. And if there is any problem, safety or otherwise, with any new technology, that's not an excuse to stop pursuing new technology. It's an imperative to make sure that that new technology unfolds well, unfolds safely, and that's what our department has been doing for as long as it's existed.
Yes, our EV technology is world leading at this point, but it is subject to being overshadowed by what is taking place in other nations. Can you talk about that?
Well, China has invested hugely in its EV capabilities. I don't believe that's because the Chinese Communist Party is enthusiastic about the environment. I believe it's because they perceive the economic and strategic benefits of trying to dominate that market, which is one of the reasons why the Biden administration is protecting the U.S. market with appropriate tariffs on that unfairly subsidized Chinese industry. We face fierce competition from around the world, just as we did in the first chapter of the automotive industry. But we're determined as an administration, and I'm determined as a child of the industrial Midwest, to make sure that America leads the way in the EV revolution, just as we led the way the first time around in the arrival of automobiles a little over 100 years ago.
You know, the Biden administration has been responsible for creating 16 million plus new jobs during this 3.5 years in office. Can you tell us about job growth that is associated with the EV industry?
Well, we've seen EV battery and manufacturing facilities rise across the country, of course, in Georgia, in my home state, both my new home state of Michigan that I married into and my state where I grew up of Indiana. And whether we're talking about the battery side or the manufacturing side, we know that we've got the opportunity to create new, good-paying jobs. Part of what was at stake in the UAW strike and the historic contract that those workers earned was to make sure that that EV economy continues to create not just large numbers of jobs, but good-paying jobs. And that's part of why the president was so proud to be with those auto workers as they sought that great opportunity.
First time a president has been on a picket line.
That's true. Yes, sir.
And I'll note that the union movement has just exploded since the Biden administration came into office.
It's been an extraordinary time for American workers, historic contracts in many sectors, including, of course, transportation and manufacturing.
Thank you. Let me ask you this question. The Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority and the Georgia Department of Transportation applied for the Department of Transportation's mega grant program for their Georgia 400 Express Lanes project. This project will combine the Georgia Department of Transportation's express lanes and dedicated bus rapid transit lanes to significantly improve congestion and transit access to over 120,000 jobs within a mile radius of the 5 stations. Can you discuss the strategic timing and expected outcomes of the mega grant awarded to support this initiative?
Thank you. We're working through those mega grant applications through the course of this year. Certainly recognize the enthusiasm around this project, and I can commit to you I'll make sure it gets every fair consideration, and I'll become more familiar with the specific project.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Ms. Chavez DeRemer is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, the last time you were before this committee, we discussed the short-sighted, in my opinion and many others, tolling plans in Oregon. Since then, Oregon Governor Tina Kotek thankfully has shelved those plans to toll our Oregon commuters. Another flawed tolling plan was also recently suspended in New York City when Governor Kathy Hochul announced that she would pause the congestion pricing for commuters in Manhattan, a plan that a few of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle on this very committee opposed. And Mr. Secretary, do you think the suspension of these tolling plans is indicative of a larger trend? And to follow up with that, the general public seems to me, and I think to many others, they're finally had enough of paying these exorbitant prices. And as former mayors, and we discussed that earlier, we care about what's happening on the ground in our districts, and that's where we get the feedback. So can you answer those questions for me?
Well, of course, we take care to respect the role that state and local governments have in making decisions that are in their jurisdiction, and often these tolling calls are among them. I also recognize that states and local jurisdictions face a lot of challenges in funding roads, bridges, other things that are needed. Where we come in is to make sure that any measure that is taken meets any federal requirements, if it's a federal road, but also that we provide funding to help so that there's the capital in place. That now I want to be clear, I'm not saying it's a substitute for local or state funding. In fact, the more a state or local community is ready to step up, often the more we can do in turn. But we do want to make sure we move out of the era that we lived in back when I was mayor, when it sounded like the answer too often from the federal government was, you're on your own to find a way to fund this project.
Okay, so if our governors are concerned, I just mentioned two of them, with the price tags of these large-scale infrastructure projects during the time of high inflation, and we're seeing that today. And so I think it's a good idea. And with the chairwoman sitting behind me from Utah, we're talking about permitting reform. And Congresswoman Malloy and I have a new bill, the Full Responsibility and Expedited Enforcement, or the FREE Act. This legislation aims to streamline the federal permitting process by introducing a permit-by-rule system. Permit-by-rule is an approach where we set preset standards are established for permit issuance, allowing for automatic approval once these standards are met by the applicant. This method reduces wait times, minimizes bureaucratic delays, and focuses on compliance enforcement rather than lengthy initial reviews of the permit application. The reconstruction of significant infrastructure like the Francis Scott Key Bridge requires coordinated efforts between the federal and state agencies. Permit by rule can enhance this coordination and lead to more efficient uses of resources and faster completion. Another large infrastructure project my constituents are all too familiar with is the I-5 bridge replacement, which is slated to begin construction in late 2025, but not completed as a project until 2033, 8 years. I can't help but imagine that if permit by rule were to be implemented to at least some portions of the project, that Oregonians and Washingtonians would be able to traverse the Columbia River much sooner. So with that said, Mr. Secretary, how are the federal and state agencies collaborating to ensure a smooth permitting process for bridge reconstruction?
Well, we want to make sure that the permitting process is not an obstacle to prompt project delivery.
But it is.
And we've undertaken a number of measures to help with that. That's included programmatic agreements so that you can batch projects if they might travel together because they have certain things in common. Just digitizing the NEPA process we find could add a lot of value. We've launched a modernizing NEPA challenge, and we're promoting more of those kind of web-based approaches. And we're maximizing the use of categorical exclusions. Now, admittedly, that won't apply in a project as large and complex as the IBR. We understand that.
But do you think that implementing the permit by rule, which again would provide the clear standards, expedite permit issuance, serve as a model for future infrastructure projects to enhance that interagency coordination and reduce those permitting delays? I mean, that seems to be the problem, and it costs money.
I'm interested in anything that can reduce unnecessary delays, so I'd welcome a chance to see more about the text of your proposal and how it might be put to work.
Okay. Well, the smaller scale project, installing the EV chargers, there was some conversation, but it was recently reported that despite the administration's commitment to install 500,000 chargers by 2030, only 8 have been installed since the IIJA was enacted 2 years ago. Mr. Secretary, installing an EV charger can't be that hard if the funding's already allocated. And if the projects were to receive categorical exclusion designation under NEPA, would permit by rule help alleviate delayed construction of the chargers as well?
Without knowing the particulars of the structure of the program you're describing, it's certainly possible that anything that simplifies environmental processes could lead to a faster project delivery.
Well, I like the world of possibilities, for sure. So I look forward to working with your office on this, Congresswoman Malloy and I, and further discussing the permit by rule. on both the small and the large capacities. And with that, I'll yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
The gentlewoman yields, and thank you for the plug of my bill. And the chair recognizes Mr. Huffman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, welcome back to the committee. You are breaking good news in incredible ways to communities all over this country because of the legislation we passed in the last Congress and because of your good work implementing it. So thank you for that. But some of the questions that you've had from across the aisle have been, frankly, just casting about wildly to malign electric vehicles. And I was surprised to hear the suggestion that EV battery fires are somehow a great risk to public health, but no discussion of the fossil fuel infrastructure and vehicles and other fossil fuel aspects that are exploding and burning and harming and killing people every day in this country. Could you just sort of speak to the relative threat to human life, safety, and public health as between EV batteries and all of the fossil fuel vehicles, tankers, trucks, pipelines, and refineries that are going boom seemingly every day somewhere in America?
Well, it'd certainly be absurd to dismiss the danger and damage that has been associated with flammable liquids being used to propel our vehicles over the course of the last 100 years. Of course, there's a framework of regulation to try to minimize that danger and harm, just as we're building a framework of regulation to make sure that any harm or risk associated with electric or any other propulsion, hydrogen, you name it, is appropriately managed. We just don't view any of those risks as an excuse to stick to dirty and expensive fuels and older technology that, again, as we've been shown in sometimes shocking fashion, can lead to the destruction of property and life in incidents, not to mention the destruction of property and life being documented as a consequence of the pollution.
Well said. My colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, kind of broke the fact-check machine with some of his attacks on electric vehicles. He stated that the cost of electric vehicles is going up. Just for the record, Mr. Secretary, I believe that's false. Can you tell us what the cost of electric vehicles is doing these days?
Cost of electric vehicles is going down, and we have even seen research indicating that if you look apples to apples, which can be a little challenging, but the basic determination when you compare an EV to a comparable internal combustion engine, according to J.D. Power, is about $53,600 for an EV, $54,400 on average for the gas vehicle. That's before you account for the $2,000 or so a year that an EV owner can save in fuel costs, and the $6,000 or so in lifetime lower maintenance and repair costs, simply because an EV tends to have fewer moving parts.
Right. According to my just quick Google search just now, EV prices new EV prices are down year over year 18%, which is much more than for non-EVs over the same year over year period. And for used EVs, the prices are down even more, 27% decline in price year over year. So is that consistent with your understanding of where we're headed on prices?
Yes, and I think it's intuitive if you consider how new the EV technology is relative to internal combustion technology. In other words, any improvements we see in cost today on an ICE engine are after 100 years of refinement, whereas the stage we're at with EVs might be better compared to where we were when internal combustion got as far as the Model T. More work will happen that will make them more efficient, and it's not surprising that that cost curve is moving down faster for EVs than for ICE cars right now.
My colleague also suggested the federal government was buying the majority of EVs in America. You thankfully put that in. I think there's a math problem over there because it was 0.5% according to...
That's the most recent data that I've seen.
Yeah, pretty far from a majority. On the issue of why bother, because my colleague from Arkansas pointed out that if we electrified our transportation system overnight here in the United States, it would still be only about 1% of global emissions. My understanding is that while U.S. emissions are overall declining, the transportation sector is still going the wrong way. Could you just expand on the sort of why bother argument that has been suggested today?
I think anytime there's a national effort, or certainly a human effort that's going to require a lot of different people to hit their marks in order to succeed. That should motivate us to go above and beyond, not to sit on our hands. America's never been the kind of country that waited for other countries to solve a problem. And I believe we need to lead in this regard. As we do, again, we'll see not only climate benefits, but a benefit in terms of those deaths from particulate matter that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And just to close with an invitation to my district in Humboldt County, where you awarded a $426 million infra grant to modernize a port that will support the floating offshore wind industry. We'd love to show you that incredible project. It certainly puts the light of the notion that this administration has a build nothing ever agenda. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes Mr. Collins for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. I kind of want to take a tour around the transportation industry here for my 5 minutes, but I think everybody's kind of focused on EVs, so we're going to kind of start in that direction first. You know, there's a $400+ billion backlog in highway repair right now. We got congested interstates, and a lot of that's not due to road maintenance or accidents, it's just congestion. And we don't even have a diesel engine that'll beat the 2027 certifications. There is a clear push to EVs on Class 8 tractors from this administration. And that's just among a lot of things. Rising costs of equipment, truck parking, we hear it here, workforce issues, cargo theft, fraud, just freight fraud in general. What's the game plan with EV tractors? Because they weigh more than the diesel-equipped Class 8 tractors do. And you're going to have more trucks on the road just to move the same amount of freight that you do with a diesel engine as you do with an EV.
Yeah, trucking's a little different from the personal vehicle and light duty side, but we are seeing alternative fuels emerge on the trucking side too. The electric is more for lower distance routes than over the road. Hydrogen's also shown a lot of promise when it comes to those over the road routes, but, it's not electrifying.
That's what I just said. The EPA has structured it where we don't even have an engine for 2027. The majority of the talk in here today has been about EVs, and that's what you've been talking about. I'm part of that dirty gas burning diesel people that you talk about. I'm in the trucking industry. So what is the game plan? Because for every 6 loads that you haul with a EV truck, you're going to have another truck to put in there. Do you know how much an EV Class 8 tractor weighs?
Not offhand, no.
32,000 pounds. Do you know how much a Class 8 diesel tractor weighs, decked out with everything?
Less.
17,000.
Yep.
There's a big discrepancy there.
Yep.
The roads don't even handle the additional weight. We had one of your people in here not too long ago, and they said they were going to increase the weights that we could carry on the roads. If the roads can handle that, why don't you do it now so that we can get the congestion off the roads with the diesel engines that we do have out there?
Well, we're certainly working on developing solutions for pavement durability to make sure as they come under increased pressure, whether it's from traffic, weather, or anything else, that they last longer
I
than
don't
they used
think
to.
you have a solution EV-wise, really, in reality.
I would certainly say
trucks.
the development of the technology on the trucking side is less advanced and I think less likely to lend itself to a single technology than on the light duty side.
All right, I'm burning time. Let's move on to the aviation side of this thing. You plan to propose a European-style compensation scheme of sorts for flights that are delayed or canceled. Congress has already passed legislation to make airlines refund passengers. The cancellation in 2023 was lower by 1.some% than it's been in decades. How do you think this rule, when it addresses circumstances that are uncontrollable, like when the government's at fault or when traffic controllers are at fault, is the government going to pay?
First of all, thanks for acknowledging the cancellations are down on our watch. When it comes to rules for holding companies accountable,
well, I don't think cancellations aren't necessarily due to you. It could be due to the industry.
Well, I'd like to believe that we helped, given the work that we did both to press industry and to make sure that FAA was able to adopt new GPS technologies that more efficiently use the airspace.
Should the government pay when they're at fault?
Charging the taxpayer for a delay doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
You talk like it's your funds. I mean, this is the Department of Transportation. Tell me, you want to make the airlines pay when it's their fault. When it's your fault, should you step up and pay?
Again, I don't understand why you would charge the taxpayer for a problem the way you charge a for-profit company if they fail to live up to the regulations.
You're charging anyone that's at fault. You said who is at fault should pay.
Yeah, if it isn't weather, if it's controllable by the airline, then the airline ought to deal with it. If it's controllable by the FAA, then we come to Congress for help dealing with it.
If it's controllable by the government, then you should step up and pay. That's right.
I mean, you expect the taxpayer to
I
pay who?
expect the people at fault to, and if you're going to demand that, you should demand it of yourself to be better.
So you don't think we should fine any companies unless we also
But
fine
I
taxpayers?
think we both can agree, don't you think that either way that the person that's going to pay for all this is going to be the person buying the airline ticket?
Well, it's interesting. So, those arguments have been raised anytime we've tried to hold airlines accountable. But what we've seen is there are countries that do this, right? That say if an airline sticks you with an unreasonable delay, you get some money for that. I'm not saying we haven't drawn any conclusions.
I know that, I
on the US
understand
version,
that.
but
There's one other thing, though, I wanted to comment on real quick, though. And I got to comment on these rail issues because, Boeing CEO, he was hammered for not prioritizing safety over DEI initiatives. Norfolk Southern, in their annual shareholders report, said that they were going to focus on DEI initiatives over anything else. And that's what led to that accident. They weren't hiring people who were qualified to put grease on
I've
wheel
never
bearings.
seen a single shred of data or evidence
I've got the
associating what
annual-
happened and somehow trying to blame that on women and minorities. I think really is not consistent with what the
Give me a second, though, we're out of
NTSB
time,
found.
but here's my question for you.
Blaming women and
What does
minorities
the
is not
Department of
consistent with what the
Transportation
NTSB found.
prioritize more, DEI initiatives or safety and maintenance on America's highways?
The top priority of this department is and has always been safety.
How many employees do you have right now that are full-time back in the office 5 days a week?
I can tell you that about 75% of our work hours are performed on site. Of course, we have a lot of workers
Not
who are
work hours, how many employees do you have full-time back in the office today?
The gentleman's time
So
has
all
expired.
worker, in terms of 100%, I'd have to pull that, but all workers are
gentleman's time
expected
has
to
expired.
work in person unless they're telework eligible, depending on a remote work arrangement.
The time has expired.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, ma'am.
The gentleman yields. Ms. Hoyle is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary. You may recall I represent the southwest coast of Oregon, and I want to thank President Biden, the Department of Transportation, and yourself personally for the work you've done to explore the viability of different federal investment options for the public-private partnership for the Port of Coos Bay intermodal project. This project is continuing to move forward. We still need federal investment, specifically in channel dredging, so U.S. companies don't have to rely on Canadian ports to move products to Middle America. The Canadians are putting billions of dollars and allowing foreign interests to put billions of dollars into their ports, and we have the ability to make sure American farmers and manufacturers have reliable access to international markets while also bringing back thousands of middle-class jobs to a region that had been economically robust prior to the shutdown of timber harvest in our federal forests. We can be an economic engine again. And first, I just want to say thank you to the administration. Thank you to you personally. But for my question, this week, the National Transportation Safety Board adopted its final report on East Palestine, the Ohio derailment, and federal track safety regulations require railroads to conduct various track safety inspections, which include visual inspections at specified minimal interviews done by human beings. Now, railroads are increasingly using a technology, as you know, you've spoken about it here today, automatic track inspections, or ATI, that uses a machine to detect track geometry defects. Now, in order to use ATI track inspection machines, there's no requirements for railroads to waive or suspend federal rail safety regulations, but railroads have been seeking to waive the required visual track inspections that are done by rail workers. So, I think that we do better when we have labor and at the table to figure out how we can use this technology best with a combination of both new technology like ATI and visual human inspection as human track inspectors look for 23 possible types of track defects, while ATI machines can only detect 6 types of track defects. So, couple of questions are, can you confirm that there are no Federal Railroad Administration regulations that prohibit railroads from running ATI technology as much as they want without reducing human track inspections? And do you agree or disagree that visual track inspections plus ATI is a safer approach than just using ATI?
Yes, and I appreciate your clarifying question, because I think sometimes it's been suggested that if we don't provide a waiver, we're preventing somebody from using ATI. Railroads are more than welcome to use this technology. We're just saying it's got to be used in combination with visual inspections. We think of it as a sort of belt and suspenders approach, enhancing the success of the human inspection regime with new capabilities that these technologies may be able to deliver. So we'll continue to work with the railroads on test programs that assess the effectiveness of that autonomous track geometry measurement in combination with visual inspections. But we also believe it's important to do both.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to invite you to come to the Southwest Coast, to come visit the Port of Coos Bay, to see all the work that we're doing. And again, I cannot tell you what it means to the people of the South Coast to have hope that we'll have jobs again, so that we don't have to ship our kids to somewhere else for them to have a really good middle-class life. Thank you.
Understood. I hope we get the chance. Thank you.
I yield the remainder of my time.
The gentlewoman yields. Mr. Ezell is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. And I thank you for what all you've been doing to help deliver some needed resources in my district in South Mississippi. I got several questions I want for us to try to get through today. So I normally talk kind of slow, so I'll try to pick it up a little bit. So let's, me and you, see if we can't get through this without us dragging it out too much. So firstly, your agency is very important to the projects in my district, starting with the two ports in the district, the Port of Gulfport and the Port of Pascagoula, my hometown. Both have a vital role in the supply chain in our nation's economy. I'm aware that the notices of funding opportunity for the PIDP, it's stated, the Secretary may give priority to providing funding to strategic seaports in support of national security requirement as required by the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. How will DOT evaluate and prioritize the critical need for the strategic seaport to support our military when ranking these grant applications?
Thank you for the question. Our Maritime Administration works closely with our military partners and seeks to gain understanding of the strategic significance of various ports when they're applying for funding. Not the only criterion, but certainly one that, to the extent statute calls for it, we consider.
Okay, very good. It was also brought to my attention there's a high record amount of obligation funds available through the U.S. Department of Transportation. States like Mississippi benefit greatly from the additional funds. However, requiring state DOTs to obligate millions of funds in 1 month is just nearly impossible. Mr. Secretary, what steps can be put in place to help streamline this process and allow ample time for the state DOTs to obligate these funds?
We're certainly aware of the pressure that the state DOTs feel when that August redistribution comes around, and we want to make sure that we have as much flexibility as possible. I'll note that the President's budget for 2025 for federal highway does have some provisions that would help, we believe, make that easier, more flexible, reduce that pressure, and we'd welcome working with you in a little more detail on that, because we know that it's a very intense exercise on top of the work the DOTs are already doing.
Okay, thank you. Additionally, can you explain why you requested almost half of what you requested in FY 2024 for FY 2025 for the CRISI grants?
So CRISI is an excellent, popular, oversubscribed, and important program. We're proud of the work we've been able to do with CRISI. We're also trying to color within the lines of the limits, the top line limits provided by the Fiscal Responsibility Act, but are hopeful that there will continue to be adequate funding to do projects. We always get more applications than we can say yes to.
Thank you. As we get ready for the hurricane season, it's crucial that U.S. Department of Transportation, along with other relevant state and federal agencies, coordinate to prepare for the season. Can you tell me what you've been able to do to help coordinate with Mississippi so that we can get ready for a hurricane season?
I was just in Mississippi a few days ago, different part of the state up in the Delta, but got a sense of how that's already on everybody's mind there. We're mindful at our department, too, of the opportunity to work with state DOTs and anybody else we need to coordinate with. We do that through our Transportation Operations Center and the emergency support function assigned to us by statute, and we stand ready to help. We hope it is a hurricane season everybody can get through without incident, but we know what we're up against, and we'll be there to help.
Thank you very much. And the last one, several members of my district have expressed concerns over your agency's goal to achieve zero emissions on their electric vehicles, mainly the public transport and those kinds of things. Does U.S. DOT plan to mandate a forced phase-in over time of electric vehicles, or will the agency continue to allow transient systems to determine what type of alternative fuel technologies works best for them?
Our approach has been to create options and to provide economic support, whether we're talking about personal EVs or whether we're talking about those low-emission buses that we're buying for a lot of transit agencies. We know that it's not a one-size-fits-all, and we want to work with those transit agencies on answers that make sense for them.
Very good, and we yield back with 22 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes Mr. Allred for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us again. I appreciate your patience today. I want to thank you for your continued support in getting the IIJA funding out of D.C. and into our communities. This legislation has had a significant impact in North Texas and will continue to shape our community for years to come. In fact, you just mentioned low-emission buses. In June of last year, DART, the Dallas Area Rapid Transit Agency, received a $103 million federal transit grant to help us modernize our bus fleet. In March of this year, the Southern Gateway Park and Clyde Warren Park and other North Texas projects received $80 million in funding from USDOT, thanks to grants as part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the IIJA. But one project that you and I have discussed several times in this setting that I'd like to highlight is Amtrak's partnership with Texas Central to develop a high-speed rail connecting Dallas and Houston, two of the largest metropolitan areas in Texas and the country. In December of '23, the project was awarded a $500,000 grant as part of the Corridor ID program funded through the IIJA, and this now public-private partnership, I think, is a great example of this administration's and our commitment to environmentally sustainable transportation while simultaneously supporting economic growth. And so you talked a bit about this when you were last in Dallas on TV, but here, could you just mention a little bit about how serious your agency is and you are about high-speed rail in Texas?
Thank you. We are enthusiastic about the potential, and the funding that comes with this corridor ID designation is both direct funding for planning activities and a signal of the potential that we see. When you look across the geography of the United States, the best candidates for high-speed rail service are geographies where you have two major metropolitan areas that are fairly close to each other, but really a short flight that borders on the realm of impracticality, or a long drive that also borders on the realm of impracticality. And creating that third option of a good high-speed ride can, we think, unlock enormous economic potential, and even for the people who don't use it, bring benefits in the form of reduced congestion on those roadways and those airports. So we look forward to seeing this proposal continue to develop, and I would be surprised if it did not lead to more applications for support as the vision continues to take shape.
I think that's right. And you mentioned, of course, reducing congestion. I have made that drive many times from Dallas and Houston. It's not an easy drive. The flight is not always the most convenient option. To me, this would just spur so much economic growth, and it's a common sense idea. But there's also the technology involved in it that I just wanted to briefly discuss, which is, I think it's the Shinkansen bullet train, which is made in Japan. It's the world's safest transportation technology, really, in many ways, operating without a fatality since 1964. Can you speak about your experience with this technology? And I understand that you might have had a chance to ride on one of these.
Yes, I had the privilege of riding on the Shinkansen train in Japan when I was attending the G7 meetings hosted by Japan last year for transportation ministers and my counterparts. It was an extraordinary experience, especially sitting up in that cab where I had an opportunity to observe the operator and seeing the operations center behind the scenes where they conduct those safe and efficient operations. It is rare for them to be more than a few seconds at variance from their published schedule. And as you mentioned, in a technology in a train going back to the 60s, they have an unbelievable safety record too. I think any American who sees that comes home and says, why can't we have something like this? And I think that's the kind of quality and the kind of efficiency that we should aspire to here in the U.S.
I am convinced that if we get one of these lines in Texas, we will get more. We are a perfect candidate for this. And really quickly, in the last 30 seconds I have here, I just want to commend you as the father of two small kids. I know your growing family, and to highlight the fact that passengers will no longer have to pay more to sit next to their kids on flights. To me, this is just common sense, but it's the kind of thing that really can make an impact in people's lives. And I think it's an example of your leadership. And at some point in our next discussion, I'd love to talk to you about our air traffic controllers and how this FAA bill is going to help us restore that workforce. But with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Duarte is recognized for 5 minutes.
Hello, Secretary. Thank you for joining us here today. Last time we were here, we talked about two things. One was the high-speed rail project in my district, which is the California High-Speed Rail Project. The $128 billion high-speed rail project that was a state initiative that will move from Merced, a city of 60,000, down to Bakersfield, a city of approximately 350,000, I believe. Are those the type of metropolitan centers that you were just meaning to describe when you talked about the best candidates for high-speed rail?
On their own and in a vacuum, it is unlikely that they would generate that justification. But of course, that Merced to Bakersfield segment represents a step toward connecting two of the largest economic areas in the United States.
So after we've spent $128 billion going over flat land between Merced and Bakersfield, we'll then think about how we're going to get through the mountains and the urban areas of Los Angeles and the Bay Area to then finish the high-speed rail project someday in the distant future?
Well, the Bakersfield to Merced segment comes first. And yes, as I understand it, the vision of the project sponsors is ultimately to fully connect all the way through to the downtowns.
Are you
of those two
capable
regions.
of recognizing a hopeless boondoggle? Because that's what we're discussing right now.
I've seen a lot of the most compelling and ambitious human projects characterized as hopeless boondoggles during the time that they were taking shape. And I'm not surprised for a project that represents the first movement in the United States of America toward this kind of technology, that it has proven to present a lot of challenges for those first movers.
Thank you. Let's move on to something even more important, in my opinion. Representative Owens, a good friend of mine, earlier discussed the electric vehicle trade, the proxy imperialism that American taxpayers are sponsoring in the Congo in the pursuit of cobalt. I don't know, I guess God shined on us today because just walking in the atrium of Rayburn Office Building here, we have a Congolese delegation talk about economic development in Congo. So I got a quote from Abraham Leno, who was sitting in here a little while ago, but his schedule does not permit for him to be here right now. Nonetheless, I'd encourage you to speak to him on your way through there today. Let me quote Abraham Leno. He actually provided me a quote that I'll read verbatim. Children are working in situations with exposure to chemicals like mercury and going into mines with no safety regulations or oversight. Beyond the daily tragedy, Congo is losing the productive labor force of the future and people who would contribute to a brighter future with a stronger civil society. I've read the book, or at least audiobooked, I'll admit, Cobalt Red. As you pursue these electric vehicle technologies, you call it technology, but technology in my book makes lives better. I don't see electric vehicles making lives tremendously better here in the United States. They're crushing lives around the world. We've got slave trade in Congo.
I just can't accept
slave
that that's a
labor.
necessary
No, then don't
consequence
accept
of newer
it.
technology.
Don't accept it. If you feel a glow driving an electric vehicle here today in America, go ahead and feel that. There are children in mines being crushed. There are families being broken. There are warlords forcing these people into slavery around the world.
And I trust
Provide
anyone
that-
serious about
provide
confronting that will
moral
join
glow
us
or
in
whatever you
enforcing
get,
our
driving in an
protections
electric
against forced and
vehicle
child
today.
labor.
That's
I
your
must
value
also
system.
say
I
that
can
I am
appreciate it.
puzzled to
If you
find
wanna
people
support
who have
world
shown
slavery and you
no
wanna
interest
support-
in dealing with
excuse me, my
forced and
time,
child
not
labor in
yours.
any other product
You
suddenly
are
become
forcing
concerned
child
about
labor
it
in the
this case.
Congo.
No.
It's documented. It's been known for decades. You want to talk about reparations. Your party wants to talk about proxy imperialism in our history. We are practicing imperialism today through the Chinese Communist government going in to extract
We're
the minerals
competing with the Chinese
necessary.
Communist government to build this on U.S. soil, and
You
we
are-
wish we would
you
have
are
your help on it.
subsidizing the Chinese government today.
We're
with
subsidizing the
your
American
EV.
auto industry.
You are subsidized. You are not going to tell me you believe. Go ahead. Tell me you believe that the majority of batteries produced for American EVs that are receiving federal subsidies today are being produced with constituents and components sourced in America and are slavery-free.
What I can tell you is that
No, that's a
today's
very
EV
simple statement. Do you believe the constituents and components in American electric vehicles being subsidized by our government today are slavery-free?
Here's what I can tell you. 80% less cobalt is going into today's EV batteries. Most of the cobalt that is used comes as a byproduct from nickel and copper mining, and major battery makers
So
in
you don't
the
want to
U.S.
discuss
such a, could
slavery.
you please let me
You'd
finish
no,
this
you're not
sentence?
finishing. I asked you about slavery. You're telling me about constituents and other components. Ask me, just answer the question I actually asked, which is, do you believe the electric vehicles being produced and subsidized by American taxpayers today are slavery-free, fair trade vehicles?
I should certainly hope that they are, and if there's any specific evidence of any violation of any provision to prevent forced and child labor of any product, any of the 159 products listed,
Will you speak to our
we
friends
will
from
work on
Congo
that.
out
Now, what
here?
I would also,
Will you
look, we
speak to our friends
can
in
do one
Congo
of,
out here in the atrium
I'm
today
just
on your way out?
astonished that people
Will
who have
you get a
shown
whole-
zero interest
Will
in
you-
confronting
will
forced
you-
or child labor on any of the other 158 products listed are suddenly terribly concerned about it on this one
We are
product, which we can
subsidizing
actually
this with
do
American
without
taxpayer.
that much
This isn't
cobalt.
just about unfair competition. This is about subsidizing child labor through American.
Then why didn't you vote for the provision to
The
move it
time
onto
has
U.S.
expired.
soil?
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Moulton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Ms. Secretary, good to see you. Thank you very much for joining us here today. I'd actually like to start exactly where my colleague began with California High-Speed Rail. I understand the project is over budget. It's not a model for project completion. I understand there's a lot of frustration with it starting in the middle as opposed to starting at the end. But I have one very simple question for you. To meet 2050 travel demand in California, will it cost less taxpayer dollars or more taxpayer dollars to meet that with high-speed rail or by expanding highways and airports?
In my estimation, a highway and airport-only approach would cost more.
There's a lot of documentation and studies that show that too. So I agree with my colleague that this should be run more efficiently. I also think taxpayer dollars should get a good return on investment, a better return than they're getting today. And at the end of the day, we need to solve these transportation problems efficiently and in a 21st century way that uses taxpayer dollars more efficiently than just building more airports and highways where people can still sit on tarmac in thunderstorms, fight traffic on ever-congested highways, as opposed to going 200 miles per hour, 220 miles per hour like the rest of the world. So I hope we can pursue that more vigorously. Right now, of course, if you want to build an interstate highway, you get a ton of money from the federal government. If you want to build an airport, you get a ton of money from the federal government. We have a highway trust fund, we have an airport trust fund, we don't have any rail trust fund whatsoever. There's not even just a simple level playing field so that the famous American free market can make these business decisions about which mode is best. Because I'm sure there are places where high-speed rail doesn't make sense. It would cost more to solve a certain transportation problems. But in places where you get a better ROI, we should be choosing high-speed rail. It's not an option really for states today. What can we do to ensure proper federal funding to at least level the playing field so that transportation planners can just say, let's make an honest business-based decision about how to solve this congestion problem?
Thank you for the question. I think the key is to make sure we build on what we can demonstrate with the funding that we have now. What came in the IIJA was a step change in our ability to support passenger rail, but as you know, nowhere near what it will take to build a fully built-out U.S. high-speed rail network. I also am convinced, though, that when Americans experience high-speed rail and revenue service on U.S. soil, there will be no going back. That's part of why it's so important to effectively deliver those projects now underway, California and Brightline.
Well, I've made this point to you since before you were sworn in. It's proven internationally. A ton of resistance to building the first high-speed rail line in Spain. Tentacles from Madrid, all the provinces said as soon as Barcelona got their line, every other province wanted one too. And the Spanish government has made business-based decisions about where high-speed rail makes sense. They now have a national network. I think we need to look at that very carefully. Now, while this hearing was happening, there was a 20-car Canadian National derailment outside of Chicago, including some hazmat cars in Madison, Illinois. It's clear that we can make more progress on freight rail safety. And I think we need some bipartisan legislation that will not take us back to the 1950s, but move us forward, push the industry forward to hopefully not only improve safety, but improve reliability and service as well. How do we develop freight rail legislation that doesn't just push more traffic onto trucks? Because we want our railways to be safer, but we don't want them to not be used, because even in the horrific derailment in East Palestine, exactly 0 people were killed. Every week on the highways, people die in hazmat accidents because that traffic is on trucks and not on trains.
You make an incredibly important point, which is that pound for pound, rail transport is safer and less polluting than alternatives. Of course, trucks play a vitally important role, but in terms of making sure that we fully use our rail networks, there's a benefit to that many times over in congestion, air quality, emissions, and safety. So that means we have to do, I think, a couple of things. First of all, ensure the safety of freight rail, and I think that the bipartisan legislation being considered in this chamber would help with that. And secondly, I think that the companies need to invest in capacity. Unfortunately, under the so-called precision scheduled railroading approach, leaders of those Class I freight railroads are under pressure to extract as much value as they can out of their railroads without really investing in capacity.
I agree with you, Mr. Secretary. I'm almost out of time. I just want to extend this point to passenger rail as well. When we spend billions of dollars subsidizing people to get into more cars as an inevitable result of the EV policy, then we're going to have more congestion on our highways. We're going to have a lot of silent traffic jams, but there's still going to be traffic jams. We got to level the playing field and make sure Americans have the choices, the freedom to travel at 200 miles per hour like the rest of the world. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Bean is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good afternoon to you. Good afternoon, Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and good afternoon, Secretary. It's great to see you. The Biden administration is on a mission to force consumers to buy electric vehicles that they clearly don't want.
No, we're not.
Of the 282 million. Well, let me tell you, Mr. Secretary, you are, because the Biden administration is spending billions in subsidies to force consumers to make these decisions. 282 million vehicles are on the roads today. 1% are electric, and they're only buying them because we are bribing consumers with $7,500 to purchase that vehicle. They sit on the lots far longer, on the dealership lots, than their traditional counterparts. And now, knowing that these cars are built with slave labor, is there a time that you will say, you know what, this is just too expensive. This is just too expensive. We want to rethink this policy. Is there ever a time that you're going to say that it's too expensive?
If you think this is expensive, wait till you find out how much oil and gas subsidies you've been supporting.
Are you aware?
Also, wait till you find out the economic impact that some economists have put at $15 million every hour or every day. Trillions of dollars every year from allowing the environmental conditions in this country and the planet to worsen. We are
Mr.
making
Secretary,
sure that there is
not what
support for a
consumers are saying.
homegrown.
Consumers are saying this. They're saying 46%. McKinsey and Company, a consumer survey company, did a survey of consumers. 46% that bought these electric vehicles.
Having worked at McKinsey, I got to tell you, it's not
specialist.
specialist.
They don't want them,
in,
Mr. Secretary.
whoa,
Are you
whoa, whoa.
aware of that? Are you aware of it?
Yeah, with all due respect to my former colleagues at McKinsey, their study is an outlier, and
One of
even
the
that
things
one
they
does
said-
not
well,
show
here's
that a
the thing.
majority
Let's
of the
just talk
people.
about it.
Great
Let's
if I
talk
could
about it
finish my
because
sentence.
a third of them
Why
said
do you
they can't
think more
charge.
Americans buy
they can't-
EVs every
Hold
year
on,
than the year
Mr.
before?
Secretary. I got a good question for you.
Okay.
And I want you to hear me.
Yeah.
Because
because 40 of those, the percentage, a third said they can't charge their vehicle. We gave you some money, billions of dollars to build some charging stations.
Yeah, and that's going out to the
How's
states
that
to build the
coming along?
chargers.
How's
It's coming along great. We're going to beat our goals of 500,000 chargers by 2030. And the reason why is because most of the states
All right.
now have their money and they're getting ready to do
What's
the
the
procurement. and
tally
put those
right now,
chargers
though?
in.
I'm keeping, last month it was 7 charging stations.
186,000 public charging stations are available. The publicly supported chargers
How many
will go in
how
the
many have we
second
built?
half.
How many have you built?
Those are coming later. That was always the plan.
Is it over 7? Is it
What's
over?
that?
Is it over 7?
They're coming later.
So it's not over 7. I'm going to put you down at not over 7 right now.
2027, 2028 is when they're supposed to be built. But here's the other thing. Are you conscious that 80% of EV charging
Wait a minute, I got 3 more
happens at
questions.
home?
You got to go fast, Mr. Secretary. How are we going to fund roads if electric vehicles aren't paying into the gas tax to build roads? We know they're heavier. They do more damage than roads. What's the plan? Do we have a plan how we're going to build those roads?
Yeah, we're working with Congress on how to make sure the Highway Trust Fund has adequate sources of revenue, knowing that receipts from the gas tax have been declining for some
Okay,
time.
hold on
I
a
don't think
second.
that's an excuse to
Hold on.
stick with the dirty
Hold on,
and
Mr.
expensive
Secretary.
tools of the
Let me
past.
put you down. I got to put you down. No plan yet. Let me put that down.
Well,
Here's the thing.
actually, you should put down
Hey,
something
Vulcan,
else on your little paper there, which
So
is we are
when we
funding
build
pilots
roads-
to
when
do
we
vehicle
build
miles
roads, we
traveled. So
use-
did you put that down?
When
Are you
we,
gonna put that down?
when we build
Would you
roads,
be so kind as to put that down on my
gotcha.
behalf?
I'm putting it down right
Appreciate
now,
it.
Mr. Secretary. Listen, when we build roads, we used aggregates and other
Sure do.
rocks and materials. One of the companies that has part of their headquarters in Jacksonville, Florida, is Vulcan. 2 years ago, Mexico took over their aggregate plant. They just walked in, the government walked in, took their plant, hasn't compensated them at all. And since that time, aggregate and building roads and building anything in America has gone up. Is that on your radar screen of how we can get this plant back or get American assets that was taken over by Mexico? Is that on your radar screen? Are you aware?
I'm not familiar with this plant, but I'd love to learn more. Pavement is actually one of my unfashionable passions. I think that if we do better with pavement durability and
Okay.
sourcing,
Just
we're
know
going to
that
do better on our
Mexico, if
highways.
anybody's listening, Mexico took over a company, an American company, without compensation. And I got one more question, and hopefully we can bring it in for a landing, and that is turbulence. Everybody knows I'm scared of 2 things, clowns and turbulence. You said turbulence is caused by climate change. I want to give you a chance. Do you believe that?
Yeah, the
And here's the thing. It's just you and I. You don't have, it's just you and I. You can tell me honestly.
Sure. So scientists believe that turbulence, especially of the wind shear variety, has increased as a consequence of climate change.
Listen,
Are you aware of that?
your National Transportation and Safety Board said calling it climate change caused turbulence is hogwash. I wish we could have, I love chatting with you.
I'd be happy to
Mr.
send you the
Secretary.
study.
I love chatting with you, and I regret that I'm out of time. Thanks for coming. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Afternoon.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Stanton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg, for being here today. Mayor Pete, you know that there is no better investment than public infrastructure. In the 3 years since the bipartisan infrastructure law was signed, our country, especially Arizona, has benefited. In fact, just last week, Valley Metro received over $15 million to expand the streetcar system from the city of Tempe into the city of Mesa. And in January, Arizona received a $95 million infra grant to widen Interstate 10. And that investment directly benefits the Gila River Indian community, helping fulfill the administration's goal to direct 40% of infrastructure dollars to historically disadvantaged communities. And I know you agree, the success of the 22 federally recognized tribes is critical to all of Arizona, just like tribal communities all across the United States of America. You know, we have not kept up our treaty obligations to our tribal partners, especially in underinvestment in infrastructure. And this administration wants equity in transportation investments. I applaud that. What are you and DOT doing specifically to channel investment to our tribes and tribal communities?
Well, thanks for the question. Every time I'm in Indian country, I see the extraordinary need and the demand that those tribal governments face, maintaining often extraordinarily extensive road networks with shockingly little by way of funding. It's one of the reasons we work to increase support for tribal as well as rural communities, and we've been pleased to see a lot of success in terms of some of the competitive grant processes, including, as you mentioned, the Gila River Indian community. I'm really excited about what we can do with them on I-10. We now have an assistant secretary level office for supporting tribal communities, all 574 of them, and specific programs, including our Tribal Technical Assistance Program, to help make sure that these communities can succeed, not just in winning those grants, but also in delivering them, because we know it can be a real challenge after you get the good news to see those processes through.
That's great. Mr. Secretary, you and I have both heard so many horror stories about the air travel experience for passengers with disabilities, particularly people who utilize mobility devices. This committee has worked hard on the issue on the recently passed FAA reauthorization, including a couple of bills that I authored to make the travel experience better. You have made this a priority as well. Why is this important, and what more work do we have to do to support passengers with disabilities?
When you talk to passengers with disabilities, particularly wheelchair users, you hear so many stories of the experiences that they have had that reflect really a lack of access to safe and dignified air travel. So we have issued a final rule that's requiring airlines to make lavatories on new single-aisle aircraft large enough for passengers with wheelchairs, after hearing stories of passengers who either dehydrate themselves or just don't fly at all because they don't have access to an accessible bathroom. And in March, we published a notice of proposed rulemaking for new requirements on training and practices, making it clear that damaging or delaying wheelchairs is a violation that can be met with penalties. Some wheelchair users have told me that arriving in a destination without a wheelchair is like arriving without your legs. And it doesn't just ruin your trip, but if an airline takes forever to fix it, that affects you long after you have returned home. So we're going to continue to work with advocates and we're going to take a tough line on these any violations here, because it really is just unacceptable for passengers to go through what some passengers tell us about.
I very much look forward to working with you on that, because it stops job opportunities and so many other ways that it impacts the lives of people with disabilities who are talented and deserve to have the passenger experience improved. As mayor of Phoenix, I propose and ask voters to approve the single largest transportation infrastructure plan in Arizona history, the first of its kind in scope, to expand public transit, including our light rail system, and modernize our roadways. They did by an overwhelming margin. This year, the people of Maricopa County will decide again with Prop 479, a proposed dedicated half-cent sales tax extension to fund critical transportation. Mr. Secretary, as communities across the country vie for competitive federal funding, explain why it's important for states and localities to have their own dedicated transportation funding source to be competitive for those grants.
Well, I appreciate the question, because with the historic funding available through the bipartisan infrastructure law, I don't want anybody to get the idea that that means states or local governments shouldn't do much. The reality is, the more you can put together on a state or local basis, the more you can unlock on the federal side, and the better partner we can be. So we applaud cities and states that are taking the initiative to fund their infrastructure needs, knowing that we have a wind at their back in the form of the programs and grants we have.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Kiley is recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. You've testified today on the topic of EVs that there is no mandate. You've said that we have not forced anyone to purchase any particular vehicle. You've testified that you want power to be in the hands of consumers. Is that a fair characterization of your testimony?
That we don't have an EV mandate? That's correct.
That's correct. Okay, so I'm of a similar view. I don't think that I'm all for EVs. I have a lot of constituents who buy them. And I think that you're right, that there will be an increasing adoption of them going forward. However, I support the right of consumers to make their own choice. So it sounds like we're on the same page there. So do you, like me, then oppose California's effort to take that choice away from consumers by banning gas-powered vehicles?
We respect that states can make their own decisions about state policies, but at a federal level, our approach has to do with economic incentives and support for chargers, not any kind of mandate coming out of the DOT on what technology you're supposed to buy for your vehicle.
Sure, but you've said you support giving choice to consumers. Now you've said you support giving choice to states, but those two are conflicting because the state is taking that right away from consumers. So why is it that you side with giving the state the choice as opposed to giving the consumer the choice?
Because this is federal policy. I make federal policy, and our federal policy is to support consumer choice. But look, sometimes our federal policy is a floor, and states decide to go above and beyond that.
But as you're aware, the federal government has actually given California the authority to issue that ban through a waiver under the Clean Air Act. So do you support the conferral of that waiver?
I think that's on the EPA side of the house, so I want to make sure that I'm conscious
I
of the
understand.
jurisdictional differences, but, and I'm not informed enough on EPA's processes to weigh in on their policy choices. What I'll say again is that at the federal level in the Biden-Harris administration, our strategy with regard to EVs is to make sure there's more chargers out there and to make them more affordable.
Sure, but I just want to, I'm trying to parse out your position, because on the one hand, you say you favor giving consumers choice, and on the other hand, you seem to be standing behind an administration policy that is enabling the biggest state in the country to take that choice away. So which is it?
I'm talking about federal policy.
And
when I
federal
talk about
policy is
not
enabling this choice that now California is also bringing 18 other states along with.
Yeah, enabling, not requiring.
So do you support legislation to take that waiver away?
You mean federal legislation to preempt the ability of states to make their own decisions?
No,
As a
that's
general
not
rule,
correct.
no.
It's a special authority that's been granted to the states to make that decision. So
Mhm.
you're supporting granting special authority to ban gas-powered vehicles, correct?
States may seek waivers, and if they qualify under the law, we'll consider them. Again, I don't want to get into the weeds of something that another agency is doing because I'm not privy to all
Well,
the
you are the
details
Secretary of
the EPA side.
Transportation, and this is a massive question of transportation policy. So I was just wondering if you had a view, yes or no?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's many cases where states have led the way by going above and beyond a federal floor.
Sure. Let's turn to high-speed rail for a moment. Your administration has given, or your department has given $3.1 billion to this project recently. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the governor of California said this show of support from the Biden-Harris administration is a vote of confidence in today's vision for that project. Do you agree with that statement from Governor Newsom, that you have your confidence in the current vision for California high-speed rail?
We don't approve awards for any project if we're not confident in the integrity of the application and the ability of the project sponsor to meet whatever is required for them through the application process.
But you are
and whatever
aware
they
that the
said they
project
would
has been
do.
a nightmare in California, correct?
It's kind of a subjective question. What I'm aware of is it's creating a lot of good-paying jobs. It's taken a long time, and it's a
Well,
big
this is
investment.
actually the term the New York Times used in an article, how California's bullet train went off the rails. It called it a multi-billion-dollar nightmare. The LA Times reported it's $100 billion short in funding right now, and the New York Times also said that it's not on track to be finished this century. That is not on track to be finished this century. Do you disagree?
I would be surprised if it took till the end of this century to deliver quality high-speed rail in California. So I suppose in that respect,
When do you think
I
it will be
disagree.
finished?
I didn't hear you, sorry.
When do you think it will be finished?
I have seen projections for when the Merced to Bakersfield segment will come online. We're looking into the next decade for sure for the bulk of the revenue service.
Okay, but you earlier stated in response to my colleague from California's questions that the sort of funding is predicated on it ultimately going from LA to San Francisco. So I'm asking, when do you think that will be completed?
I'm not going to get ahead of the High-Speed Rail Authority there on their latest projections for when future stages could
Well, no,
be
you've
completed.
already gotten there. You've given them $3.1 billion. So certainly you have some thought as to when
For the
this
Bakersfield
might
and
actually
Merced
be of
segment.
some benefit to California consumers.
Well, obviously, the moment it's in revenue service, it's a benefit to some California
Right. So do you think
consumers.
it'll be before the century?
Yeah,
Do you think it'll be before the mid-century?
yeah.
You do? Okay, so when? What's your best estimate for when we'll have operational high-speed rail from...
I'm not going to estimate a year for the San Francisco to LA corridor.
Okay. Do you think that the technology will still be state-of-the-art by the time it's complete?
I think the technology would be a lot better than what Americans are accustomed to today.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes Mr. Menendez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for being here today and all the important work that the Department of Transportation carries out every day. While we appreciate everything the department is doing to facilitate the historic Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and improve transportation across the country, our constituents are dealing with serious issues during their day-to-day commutes. Several times over the past month, NJ Transit riders have experienced significant delays during their daily commutes. These delays have left commuters stranded for hours, impacting their ability to work, travel, and see loved ones. Over the course of the last 6 weeks, Amtrak disruptions have caused delays for NJ Transit riders over 20 times, including serious incidents last week that resulted in cancellations and suspension of service along the Northeast Corridor. Amtrak cites overhead wire and other infrastructure issues as the sources of these delays. This week, I, along with Representative Mikey Sherrill, led the New Jersey delegation sending you a letter here, highlighting our concerns with persistent delays in Amtrak's failure to adequately address these issues. Madam Chair, I ask for unanimous consent to submit this letter for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. We make several requests in the letter, including asking the department to conduct a thorough investigation into what led to the breakdowns along the Northeast Corridor route. But I want to just put this in human terms. We both have young families. Imagine leaving for work and assuming that you will be able to get back to your children relying on public transportation. We want to relieve congestion. We want people to use mass transit. Imagine walking out your door and not knowing when you will be able to get back home. So in your words, please, what is the department doing to partner with Amtrak to ensure that breakdowns like this never happen again?
We know that commuters on NJ Transit have been subject to infuriating delays, as you have described, and FRA personnel are involved on the ground assessing what took place and trying to get an understanding of the causes of what appears to be physical damage to NJ Transit cars operating for some of their trip, at least, on Amtrak resources. I'm aware that earlier today, Amtrak and NJ Transit announced a joint action plan. I haven't had a chance to review that, but one thing I will also direct FRA to do is to support in any way that they can that process, whether it's technical assistance, assessment, and of course, more broadly, we're working to support both NJ Transit and Amtrak with the capital funding they need. Too soon to know exactly which issues have contributed to this, but I think it's safe to expect that more broadly, reliability depends on good state of repair. State of good repair is better served by the infrastructure funding that we're getting to them.
Absolutely, and I appreciate your support. I'm just asking to treat this like the crisis that it is, because we're hearing from our residents every single day who don't want to go to work, who don't want to travel, who are worried about what childcare looks like because they're not sure, there's no reliability, and it is a crisis for so many residents. I'm asking you to treat it as such. Mr. Secretary, how can we ensure that Amtrak and other rail line owners are making infrastructure improvements and upgrades that result in better service?
Well, partly what we can do is directly help. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act gives us unprecedented resources to help various infrastructure owners. Sometimes it's Amtrak that New Jersey Transit counts on. Sometimes it's the Class 1 freight railroad that Amtrak counts on. I also believe the Surface Transportation Board's work of stepped-up enforcement and attention to the legal responsibility that host railroads have to allow passenger rail to take priority is an important part of this, and we welcome the attention that the STB is paying to that. And anything else we can do to support those processes is certainly something of great interest to us, because on-time performance and reliability is vital for the reasons you just went through in terms of people's daily lives.
I appreciate that. And on this topic, lastly, can you describe how the department tracks and monitors Amtrak spending, including how Amtrak allocates its funding to state of good repair versus other initiatives?
I know that the department receives extensive documentation from Amtrak. I wouldn't be in a position off the cuff to characterize some of the breakdowns that appear there, but given Amtrak's unique kind of quasi-public structure, it's subject to a lot of requirements around transparency, and of course we get the challenge they face in balancing operations and maintenance, personnel, and their capital needs. Our ability to support them is mostly, of course, on the capital side, but we're also a stakeholder just in the sense that a lot of funding through our department or from our department goes to Amtrak to help them meet those needs.
I appreciate, because this is on why I appreciate the Gateway program and all these long-term projects that are so critically important to the region. It's the day-to-day issues that matter to our residents. I know matter to you, so I appreciate your partnership. I appreciate you putting the full weight of the department behind this issue, and we work on this in a collaborative fashion so we can get it done. With that, I yield back. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Molinaro is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I want to commend the department's advancement in aviation for those with physical disabilities. In fact, making some strides, and we appreciate that, of course. Within the FAA reauthorization, we put some emphasis. I would ask for equal consideration for those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We are simply not making adequate progress in any area of mass transportation when it comes to those that are neurodivergent, which gets me to my first question. A year ago, we spoke about Amtrak's, what I will say, deplorable adherence to the ADA standards. They were given 20 years to advance access to their intercity rail. They are currently, all these years later, from 1990, the adoption of ADA, to today, only 30% of the 385 stations have met that ADA compliance. A year ago, and again, I know the plate is full. But a year ago, we talked briefly about what the department could do to advance and pressure Amtrak to make commitments and meet those benchmarks. Could you at least advise what can and has the department done to put pressure on Amtrak to meet those expectations?
I know this has been a topic of discussion with FRA and Amtrak, and also, of course, is in scope for what we have since been able to do a lot on more broadly in our transit and transportation systems, which is the ASAP funding that's helping us to retrofit old stations. But the need is enormous. So there's really two ways to come at this. One is support for capital improvements that are needed to get this done. But the other also is the enforcement side of the house. And so we do have Title VI capabilities anytime there is a more specific civil rights related.
How often does the department take action using the enforcement mechanism as it relates to ADA compliance at Amtrak?
I'd have to go back and pull that data.
It would be helpful because I suspect, and this is not just your administration, but prior administrations have allowed far too much leeway, and quite frankly, this population is just being unmet, and it truly is a disgrace and a violation of their own civil rights, if not simply an acknowledgement that there's lack of access. On the similarly, I have a concern as it relates to New York State's abandonment of congestion pricing. I know one of my colleagues may have mentioned it earlier. I'll be candid with you. I think in New York State, congestion pricing actually causes a greater pain for those who can afford it least, in particular those who are forced to commute into the city of New York for employment. Did the governor of the state of New York provide prior notice to the Department of Transportation that, in fact, the state would abandon congestion pricing?
I did get a call from the governor that she was planning to take that step.
Was that 24, 36, 48 hours before the announcement?
I don't recall what day it was, but it was that same week.
It was almost immediately prior to that announcement. Subsequent to her announcement, the DOT offered some additional approval of congestion pricing, knowing that, in fact, the state had abandoned it. Is it your understanding that the state's abandonment is temporary or permanent?
We don't know. That's up to the state. But what we know is we have certain responsibilities to process information and approvals and permits unless we are formally notified to do otherwise. So the environmental assessment process continued. But the next step would be for the state to sign on the VPPP agreement. That has not taken place yet.
So is it some expectation that so the state can now simply temporarily withhold signature indefinitely?
Effectively, yes, the state would either proceed
it can be
or
indefinite.
would not proceed.
But it is fair for the state simply to, having gone through this process, to now just abandon it entirely. They can do that.
In terms of compliance with the environmental assessment, they've met their marks and we've met ours.
How many federal dollars do you think have been committed to assisting either in the environmental review stage or planning stage or even capital to the implementation of congestion pricing in the city of New York?
I can tell you it was a complex and thoroughgoing process. I'm not sure I'd be able to compute how many person-hours went into it.
I think it's important for the American taxpayers and New York taxpayers to know how much has already been committed and how much is going to be set aside because of the state's abandonment. It is clear to most of us in New York, and again, I have my reservations about it to begin with, that the governor of New York made a political decision. That political decision has now left the taxpayers of the state of New York with a fairly significant budget hole. And as it relates to the first line of questioning, it also leaves those who don't have access to mass transportation and mass transit in and around the city of New York still sitting on the sidelines. And I do think that the department ought to take some punitive action to recapture those dollars and at least hold states like New York accountable for wasting them. I'm out of time, but Mr. Secretary, I would appreciate some update on enforcement, at least as it relates to ADA compliance and Amtrak.
I'll try to get
appreciate
that
your
to you.
time.
Sure
Thank
thing.
you.
The gentleman yields. Ms. Peltola is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Secretary Buttigieg. It's good to see you again. Before I start my questions, I really want to thank you sincerely for coming to Alaska in August. It was great to have you in our state, seeing our complex challenges and amazing opportunities. Alaska is enormous. If we were our own country, we would be the 18th largest country in the world. We're a very big state, and a lot of logistics and transportation issues are on the top of our mind. We're all really aware of when the next barge is coming in, when the next jet is coming in. So I really want to thank you for all the work that you do. One of my top priorities, one of the top priorities for the Alaska delegation, what is the FAA Reauthorization Act. And we worked really hard to get exemptions to the deadline for the low lead avgas for Alaska. There are a number of issues. We wanted to get an extension for Alaska into the FAA reauthorization. We have serious concerns about the pace of this proposed transition to potentially an inadequately proven alternative, its potential impacts on aviation safety in Alaska, as well as the logistical challenges for distributing a replacement fuel across Alaska and its many remote communities in terms of bulk fuel storage. Since you're here today, I just wanted to underscore my concern and ask you if you'd be willing to commit to working with my office and my constituents on this important issue. 82% of Alaska is only accessible by air, and about 75% of those communities don't have a runway long enough for a jet or larger aircraft. So that avgas is really important for Alaska's aviation community, and I just wanted to acknowledge that now.
Thank you. You mentioned my recent visit to Alaska, and certainly one of the things that you come away with is just being astonished by the scale of the state and the proportion of communities that don't have road access, where aviation is literally the only way to have access there. And so we're very conscious that these general aviation aircraft are something that Alaska residents rely on for their basic daily needs. And you have my commitment that FAA's work on this transition will take that into account, and certainly welcome opportunities to work with you on how best to live up to that commitment.
Okay, excellent. My second question is, during the pandemic, there was a real national awareness about the importance of onshoring critical minerals, and this was discussed a little bit ago. Particularly rare earth minerals, which play a critical role in our modern economy and national security. Responsibly developing rare earth minerals here at home in the United States, and especially in Alaska, is a priority of mine. However, along with what's an often extremely burdensome regulatory process, which was also mentioned a little bit ago, transportation is one of the key challenges companies often encounter in getting resources from point A to point B. And I was hoping you would be able to talk a little bit about opportunities you see for rail to help advance the United States' efforts to onshore or produce these rare earth minerals domestically.
Thank you. Certainly the part of the rationale for good rail investment is the relevance of those supply chains that are shifting. And if we want to make sure that more of the materials that we have increased demand for here in the U.S. are sourced domestically, especially given the strategic and human rights concerns associated with some of the other countries vying to produce them, then we got to make sure we have the infrastructure to support that process. And that's certainly part of what could qualify something, for example, to be convincing in an application for discretionary funding to improve rail assets.
Okay, another topic, hot topic, has been electric cars. And there are communities in Alaska where it makes sense to have electric cars. I think Juneau is a really good example of high usage of electric cars. However, when the majority of our communities are creating electricity with diesel that we ship in by barge, it doesn't make sense to be pushing electric cars, and it's also in communities where it's very cold and it's hard to keep a battery alive. So my other request is that you keep outlier states like Alaska in mind when these blanket rules or proposed rules are issued. And lastly, I really want to thank you for your responsiveness. You helped Alaska a great deal with the Port of Alaska, the Port of Anchorage issue. Your MIRAD folks were really accommodating, and I just appreciate the level of response that we get from you and your department.
Well, thanks, and likewise appreciate the opportunity to work with you and your team on that.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentlewoman yields. Mr. Van Drew is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks for being here, Secretary. The Biden administration is aggressively pushing to industrialize the East Coast, as you know, with offshore wind. As Secretary, you facilitated over $200 million in maritime administration grants for wind ports. In honesty, few people support offshore wind much as strongly as you do. I want to be clear, I support clean energy. I support solar energy. I support nuclear energy. They are safe, they're economically viable, and offshore wind, in my opinion, is neither. Offshore wind negatively impacts transportation safety under this committee's jurisdiction, and that's why I ask you about it. I'm not asking you an energy question, including maritime navigation and aviation. Offshore wind interferes with radar systems. This includes maritime navigation radar and air traffic radar. And this is not me just saying this. A recent study found that mid-Atlantic wind farms interfere with 36 different land-based radar systems. This interference diminishes safety at sea and in the air. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which you're very familiar with, determined that offshore wind increases, again, it's not me saying this, it's them, the risk of maritime collisions, the risk of injury, and even the risk of death at sea. Your own FAA is now reviewing the impact of offshore wind projects on major airports, including New York's JFK Airport and, in my district, the Atlantic City Airport. In both cases, offshore wind interferes with airport flight paths. Somehow, these projects have already been approved by the federal government despite the aviation safety conflicts that exist. I have a simple question, and I appreciate a yes or a no. Can you commit to me that the DOT and the FAA, through the federal environmental review process, will block offshore wind turbines from being built in areas if found that they will threaten air traffic safety in those areas? Would that be blocked?
Yeah, FAA will never permit an unsafe condition.
So you would help to make sure that that was blocked?
If there was no alternative and it was going to be unsafe, then the FAA wouldn't be able to support it.
I just wanted you on the record on that. In my opinion, these conflicts prove that safety evaluation is incomplete to this date, and again, not just me saying, and that offshore wind is moving ahead, in my sense, prematurely. The GAO office, the Government Accountability Office, is currently conducting a comprehensive study of the impacts of offshore wind. We requested that. It includes a major focus on safety impacts. It looks at the environment, the economy, national security, utility costs, noise, natural disaster resilience, not all of which falls under your bailiwick, but some of it does. We must understand the breadth of the impacts of offshore wind. It's a permanent industrialization of our ocean. Should we wait? All I'm asking here is for the GAO study to be completed. That's not a Republican study. It's not my study. It is the Government Accountability Office, totally nonpartisan. Shouldn't we wait until their safety analysis is done before we go ahead and build offshore wind? Yes or no?
I can only weigh in on the transportation side of the house, but we will not proceed with anything we think harms safety. And if GAO or anybody else produce data or analysis that would affect a safety decision about transportation, we'd want to know it.
So we're building those projects now. Shouldn't we wait until they come back and say whether they're safe or unsafe? A purely objective, non-political, nonpartisan viewpoint.
As a general rule, we don't terminate economic development because research is underway, but when research is completed, we include that in our future work.
Well, the shame of that is, and was alluded to before, if we go ahead and are in the middle of doing these projects and find that there are safety issues where they're being placed, now we've spent huge amounts, and I mean huge amounts of taxpayer dollars, and we find out that we shouldn't move forward. Either way, we're going to move forward and it'll be unsafe, or we wouldn't move forward and spent a ton of money that we shouldn't have spent. And by the way, with offshore wind, everybody pays more. The government, huge multi-billion-dollar subsidies. Taxpayers pay more for that reason. Families pay more because the utility rates are going to increase radically. See, the difference with solar panels is when you use solar panels, it decreases the cost to the family for their energy source. When you do wind, their costs and residential utility rates are going to go way up. These developers and also are foreign countries. Now, all of that doesn't fall under you. I realize that, but the safety issues do. They are enormously expensive, and the subsidies are great. Do you support, okay, I have the last question. Do you support the offshore wind financing strategy of increasing utility rates?
We support options for the American people when it comes to energy. Again, from a transportation perspective, that's mostly making sure there's adequate port facilities.
I have more questions I would like to ask unanimous consent to put them in the record.
Where,
No, I just
without
want them in the
objection.
record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Van Orden's recognized for 5 minutes, but we've got 8 minutes to vote, so keep it brisk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Please pull up that image. Get it on the screen. Here it is. We've done this before, Mr. Secretary. Are you aware that 70% of the world's cobalt is produced in the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Yes.
Are you aware that 4.3% of every electric car battery is comprised of cobalt?
What I can tell you is that today's EV batteries use 80% less cobalt, and in
Mr.
fact,
Secretary,
most of the
please, Mr.
cobalt now
Secretary.
comes as a
Mr.
byproduct of
Secretary,
nickel and copper.
Mr. Secretary,
I'm also
I am a
concerned about
member-
the cynical exploitation of images of child labor, when the reality is that anybody concerned about that could be teaming up with us to make sure that there is compliance on forced and child
Mr.
labor for any of the
Secretary,
products that might entail them.
I'm going to remind you of something that apparently you have forgotten. I am a member of a co-equal branch of government and will be respected, and you will not interrupt me in my house.
Then I would ask you not to interrupt me either, Congressman.
Very well. Are you aware that 4.3% of all electric batteries are comprised of cobalt?
Again, I don't know the recency of that data, but I can tell you the cobalt composition is going down.
It is accurate. Are you aware that 15 to 30% of all of the cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo are artesian mines?
I believe you.
That is correct. Are you aware that approximately 40 to 255,000 cobalt miners in the Democratic Republic of Congo are children working in slave conditions?
I'm certainly aware of horrific conditions around the world in the extraction and mining industries of many minerals, including cobalt.
The last time you were here, I asked you a very specific question. How many of these children do you estimate will have to die to make the goal of electrifying 50% of the fleet by 2030 electric? This was your response. You have better data on how many children will die if we allow climate change to increase unimpeded. That tells me that you actually do have data on how many children will die from mining cobalt. If you are able to tell me that you have more data on how many children will be dying from climate change. So I'd like an answer to my question. How many children are going to have to die in those conditions to meet the artificial goal of 2030 of electrifying half of the fleet?
None, if you will work with us to make sure that anything imported is conforming to our requirements around forced and child labor.
Until that's able to take place, how many children are going to have to continue to work in slave conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo to make sure that we can meet the artificial goal of 50% of the fleet being electrified by 2030?
None is the only acceptable answer.
That is excellent. And guess what, sir? This is H.R. 8495. It's put in by my friend, Mr. Duarte from California. It's EV free trade bill. I'm going to ask you publicly now, and I'll send this to your office, if you will support this bill. You and me are 6 and 7. I know you got little kids. I got 9 grandkids. I'm going to have 11 by the end of the summer. I don't ever want your children to be exposed to any of this. I don't want my grandchildren to be exposed to any of this. And I don't think you do either, Mr. Secretary.
If this legislation represents a serious effort to ensure compliance with forced and child labor requirements and make sure that none of that finds its way into products used in America, then I would be very interested to work on that.
I will send it to you because it is laser focused on that very specific issue. So what I heard from you, Mr. Secretary, is that you do understand that there are children working in these horrific conditions, and we acknowledge this. And we acknowledge the fact that what's driving those conditions with these African children, and some of their folks are right across the way. What's driving these children, these African children, to work in slave conditions is our want and consumption of cobalt. That's factual.
Which is why we're trying to cut the use of cobalt, right? Because really in my view, we have 4 options. Stop using batteries, have batteries that don't use cobalt, source cobalt from somewhere that doesn't have the conditions of the DRC, or have better conditions in the DRC. And I think it's a combination of the last 3 that's more realistic than stopping using batteries.
I understand that. So we do know, and we're acknowledging publicly, that this is taking place and that we can work collectively to stop this, because this is terrible. And no one who has a soul can look at those pictures and say that having an artificial date of 2030 established for 50% of our fleet to be electrified is worth a single child working in slavery.
No one here, to the best of my knowledge, accepts those kinds of conditions in any product. And I hope you're equally serious about the other 158 products that have been identified as being vulnerable to child or forced labor abroad.
Mr. Secretary, I'm deadly serious about that, and I'm amazed that you and I found common accord, and I appreciate it.
Wonders never
With that, I
cease,
yield
Congressman.
back.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields. I recognize myself for one really quick minute. Mr. Secretary, this morning, in response to my colleague, Mr. Crawford, you said everything we do is a good allocation of taxpayer resources, or else we wouldn't do it. I'm not sure I agree with that, but as a member of the legislative branch with the responsibility to control the purse strings, I want to help you make that more true. So I want to just really quickly ask for your cooperation. My colleague, Ms. Chavez DeRemer, talked about the FREE Act and permit by rule and how we could make these projects move faster. The first thing it does is ask the administration to identify places where permit by rule would be appropriate. Will you work with us on identifying some of those so that we can shorten up this time period and make it more cost-effective for taxpayers?
I'd be happy to.
Okay, well, in that case, I yield back. Are there any further questions from any members of the committee who have not been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. I'd like to thank the witness for his testimony. The committee stands adjourned.
Okay.
billion for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, the $2.5 billion for the Charging and Fueling Grants Program, and the $5.6 billion for the Low and No Emissions Bus Grant Program. Congress gave the Biden administration a tall order in creating the new electric vehicle charging programs. We first required them to establish the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation to ensure coordinated federal investments and policies. We required them to issue detailed technical specifications to make sure that federally funded chargers met certain quality standards. And the Biden administration chose to issue stronger Buy America standards for electric vehicle chargers to ensure that our federal programs are supporting jobs here in the United States. We also required states to create plans to ensure investments are targeted wisely. All of this helps. All of this had to happen before the projects went out to bid. I know some have raised concerns about the pace at which these new programs are unfolding. It is important to deploy chargers as quickly as possible to help spur the transition to clean vehicles, but it is also important to get these programs right. And I appreciate the Biden administration's commitment to doing so. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about any recommendations to improve these programs. Also, I look forward to discussing the Low and No Emission Bus Grants Program. While the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act provided a significant funding increase for the program, demand for these grants still far exceeds available funding. Electrification of our transit systems can provide a roadmap for electrifying other fleets, including our commercial motor vehicles. Moving to a cleaner transportation system will require a good faith partnership between all levels of government, manufacturers, shippers, utilities, and technology companies. I hope all our witnesses will contribute to finding solutions, and I look forward to your testimony. I would like to close by reiterating my strong opposition to H.R. 7526, the D.C. Consumer Vehicle Choice Protection Act, which would repeal the District of Columbia's regulation adapting Advanced Clean Cars 2. This bill, which the Committee on Oversight and Accountability passed last month, is an attack on D.C. home rule, the environment, and public health. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady, and now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. I, too, want to take a brief opportunity to express sadness at the loss of my friend and colleague, Don Payne, Jr. He was a fierce advocate for the traveling public. He was a friend to everyone who knew him. I will miss him as well.